you and maybe comment if I need to, We'll see. Alright, guys, enjoy the show. Do I need the CC? Yeah, you might need some people need subtitles, so I'll turn on the subtitles.
If you're watching this on YouTube, you might have noticed that this episode is a week delayed. But if you want to get early access to our episodes, consider becoming a paying member. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share it with your friends.
Wait a minute, guys.
For all your support. As part of my Channel 4 documentary, The Genius of Charles Darwin, directed by Russell Barnes, I interviewed Wendy Wright, president of Concerned Women for America. I think this interview is worth looking at to get a vivid picture of the difficulties we face when we try to have an intelligent conversation with a biblical creationist. Normal standards and conventions of rational discourse simply don't enter into it. I mean, things like listening to what the other person says, that sort of thing. Admittedly, Wendy's an extreme case, but I think it's still a useful lesson.
Good morning.
Wendy Wright?
Yes.
I'm Richard Dawkins. Very
nice
kind of you to do this interview.
Yes.
Where should we go then?
Well, how's this?
Okay. Concerned Women of America. I looked up Reform America. I do beg your pardon. I looked up some of the things you're concerned about, and one of them is something I'm very concerned about too, which is Darwin and evolution. But why are you concerned about evolution?
Yes. Well, what a person believes about how human beings were created shapes what they believe about human beings. And if we believe that human beings were created out of love, that is by a loving creator, and has given each one of us not only a material body, but a spirit and a soul, we then are more likely to treat other people with respect and dignity.
Yes, but you have to contend with facts, don't you? And, I mean, if evolution is a scientific fact, you might as well be concerned about gravity or the Milky Way.
Yes. Well, there's been an effort within the scientific community to censor out information against evolution that proves that evolution may not be as many scientists believe. There have been many times in which evidence that was brought forward to bolster the idea of evolution turned out to be fraudulent. So what we argue for is to teach the controversy. Don't censor out the facts that go against evolution, such as the famous pig's tooth, the tooth that was claimed to be an example of a prehistoric man and turned out to just be the tooth of a pig. There are numerous examples like that. So teach the controversy rather than try and censor out the information that shows that evolution is questionable.
Seriously, there isn't a controversy. There may be a controversy within evolution about certain details, but the fact of evolution is uncontroversial. I mean, whether you like it or not, we're cousins of chimpanzees. We're slightly more
Guys, no.
I mean, pig's teeth are really irrelevant. Of course, you can dig up mistakes and even outright fraud. Was an outright fraud, but that was never used as evidence for evolution. It was just a particular case of somebody in the 1920s who fraudulently made up a fossil.
There's no evidence of evolution from one species to another. There's microevolution within a species, but not going from one species to another.
Oh, really?
And actually, you're the way you frame this and your very closed-mindedness really is a very good example of the kind of censorship we see within the scientific community that won't even allow discussion about the controversy, that says that we can't even discuss any evidence that might show that evolution is questionable.
Where did you study science?
Well, see, that's the point. Scientists are now claiming that they're the only ones that can speak on this issue. And yet when people who look at the evidence go to the Smithsonian Museum on Natural History, and when we look for where's the evidence to show evolution from one species to another, all we find are drawings, illustrations. There aren't the actual material evidence showing it. So while there are attempts to say that only scientists can speak on this, what we have are scientists that are then creating an isolated community and saying that we're the ones, it's almost like a religion in which only scientists are allowed to speak and teach on
now we
it
need to
and to teach everyone.
now we need to know what's the meaning of a scientist. What is a scientist? So scientist is someone who wants to know the truth about this reality, right? And I want to know that, so I'm a scientist too, isn't it, Mr. Richard fucking Dawkins?
Everyone else must believe what particular scientists say, but the scientists who question evolution are being censored out, are being blackballed out of the scientific community, and being told that the rest of the world cannot listen to them.
Yeah, the evidence is actually rather substantial. It's not just fossils, it's DNA. Presumably you're not concerned about DNA. You accept the existence of DNA, do you?
I think DNA helps to prove that each person is an individual created
just a simple question, just a simple question. So when you die, your DNA stays on this planet, your body stays on this planet, but then you die. What happens to you? You Richard Dawkins, what happens to the Richard Dawkins, the person who's talking to me? You will be still here, your body will be lying on the floor, and you will have the same DNA here on the planet Earth. But what happens to the Richard Dawkins? Where do you go? Like, why aren't you here forever? That's the problem with you, Richard. You'll figure out soon.
Arranged hierarchy. You find that our DNA is close to chimpanzees, slightly more distant from monkeys.
Yeah. So what does that like? That doesn't prove nothing.
More distant still from lizards. The whole thing falls into a beautiful hierarchical pattern, just like a family tree. It is a family tree. How would you explain that?
And where is the evidence?
Well, the evidence is in the DNA.
Excuse me. Where is the evidence of evolution from one species to another species? The macroevolution.
It's in the
And
DNA.
I'll tell you something, Richard. You are not born from monkey. Why are monkeys still here if you are a fucking monkey? I don't know. Like, Richard, think about it, right?
Geographical
There's still monkeys here around. Why are you a human and they are monkeys, Why aren't they human?
Of evolution from one species to another species.
Well, we obviously have a different conception of what evidence is. Scientists accept that as evidence. It's overwhelming, massive evidence. But let me come on to something else. It sounds to me as though you've got some kind of another agenda. Is it perhaps that your hostility to evolution, which by the way is not shared by bishops and archbishops and people like that, your hostility to evolution perhaps stems from something emotional? Like, is it that you feel that evolution? I've heard people say, for example, tell me I'm related to a monkey. I'm not related to a monkey. Tell people they're related to monkeys and they'll behave like monkeys. Tell people they're related to pond slime and they'll behave like pond slime. Is part of that the hidden agenda?
I'll tell you my hidden agenda, Richard. My hidden agenda is that I'm your God, and I'm trying to prove that. And that is the only hidden agenda I have, So I told you my agenda now. Now let's continue.
Rejection of science.
There's no hostility and there's no hidden agenda. We've been very upfront with what it is we believe. And the ad hominem attacks that people who favor evolution use against people who don't buy into that, I think shows the lack of confidence in the evidence. If evolution had so much evidence behind it, then those in favor of evolution would not have to be reduced to ad hominem attacks against those who say, show us the evidence, show us what's lacking.
Well, I think I dispute ad hominem, but I think you could understand a certain annoyance. It's a little bit as though a teacher of classics. I'm talking about education now.
Guys, Richard, I have more evidence to prove you that I am God, then you have the more evidence of this fucking evolution bullshit nonsense theory,
Schools and universities.
How is that?
Imagine that a teacher of Latin or a teacher of Roman history had to contend with people coming along and saying, the Romans never existed, the Latin language is a Victorian invention designed to,
And I think
these are cultural things, guys.
that those who favor evolution have toward those who don't buy into the idea, who say, show us the evidence, and yet those in favor of evolution can't show us the evidence that we're looking for.
I'm sorry, but we can show you the evidence. All you need to do is read an elementary textbook of biology. It's all there.
Well, that's interesting. You should bring out the textbooks on biology. We still have textbooks today
Yeah, I knew you were going
that
to talk about
show...
leopard moths and you're going to talk about Haeckel's embryos.
No. In fact, what I was going to talk about is that what they claim to be the evolution of a fetus in the womb, based on
Haeckel's
hand
embryos,
drawings,
yeah.
which have been proven to be false, and yet they continue to be published in scientific textbooks.
Haeckel's embryos are just one little thing. It's a Victorian thing. Plenty of people made mistakes.
And yet continues to be published in today's textbooks.
No longer, actually. But I don't think it's really fair, is it, to pick on particular Victorian mistakes. It is a Victorian mistake.
Oh, but it was carried over into the 20th century.
Guys, wait. Now he's talking about books. I'll show you a book evidence. Wait. They only care about fucking books. I'll show you the books.
Today, I can't help feeling that there's some sort of hidden agenda. Maybe I was wrong to say it was a thing about tell people that they're descended from monkeys and they'll behave like monkeys. Is it something else? I mean, is there some other worry that you have?
If you're looking for a so-called agenda, I'll tell you what it is. We believe that human beings should be treated with respect and dignity.
Yes.
And the reason we
so
believe
do
that,
I, of course.
the reason we believe that is because we can see that God created each one of us. And what we find is that philosophies that are built on evolution oftentimes lead to horrific abuses against human beings. And you can see why, because it's drawn on a foundation that says human beings are just material, and they should be judged according to your utilitarian use.
Guys, he just spoke about some kind of fucking books, right? Hey, where did you go? Here. These are the books you need to read, guys. These are the manual for humanity, written fucking hundreds of thousands of years ago for humans. Can you not translate that? They are in Sanskrit. So I don't know, guys, what more books do you need? These are books given to these guys, and these are the oldest scientists of the planet. These are the real scientists of the planet, 50, 30, 40,000 years ago. I'll explain later on where the book came from.
Can they provide for society?
Okay.
We don't believe that.
Yes, okay.
We believe that each human being, whether they can supply something to society or not, if they are disabled, if they are young, that they should be treated with the same amount of respect as you and I should be treated.
Yes, I mean, I accept all that, and I agree with that. I mean, I also think humans should be treated with respect. But what we have here is an agenda. It's that you want humans to be treated with respect, and therefore, if the scientific facts go against what your perception is, then you're going to distort the scientific facts.
Let's look at what evolution and Darwinism has spawned. Let's look at the philosophies that have come out of it that have been so horrific to our world. So we need to look at the philosophies behind and that have grown out of evolution. And what we find are the societies that are the most loving and caring, the societies that are the most well-functioning, are the ones that have a great respect for human beings, for others, because they recognize that each human being was created individually and is distinct from one another. Interesting enough, regarding that, you mentioned how the DNA is common among various species. But among human beings, each one of us has distinct DNA. In fact, that's the one. That's one thing that's quite a way that. I'm sorry, back up. That's one thing that scientists will use to determine who has committed a crime, is basing it on the DNA evidence. So even DNA helps to show that each human being was created individually.
DNA shows that each human being evolved individually. And of course, there are individual differences between human beings, genetic differences, otherwise natural selection couldn't happen. Now, I presented you with, I don't have them here, obviously, but you can go to any museum and you can see Australopithecus, you can see Homo habilis, you can see Homo erectus, you can see archaic Homo sapiens and modern Homo sapiens. A beautiful series of intermediates. Why do you keep saying present me with the evidence when I've done so? Go to the museum and look.
I have gone to the museums, and so have so many of us who still are not convinced
Have you
with
seen
evolution.
Have you seen Homo erectus?
Yeah, fuck this homo. You're not homo, bro. Even two leaves of a tree are not same. That's how the thing is differentiated.
This effort this rather aggressive effort to try and talk over
You
us
are only
and
an
to
animal. You're
censor
not
us
any
seems to come
special
out
fucking
of
homo. You're just an animal with a bigger brain.
frustration
All
that
right,
so many people
calm
still
down,
don't believe
homo.
in evolution. Now, if evolutionists were so confident in their beliefs, there wouldn't be the effort to censor out information that shows that evolution is still lacking and is questionable.
I confess to being frustrated. It's not about suppression, it's about the fact that I have told you about 4 or 5 fossils, and you seem to simply be ignoring what I'm saying. Why don't you go and look at those fossils?
And certainly, if they were in the museums, which I've been to many times, then I would look at them objectively. But what I go back to is that the philosophy of evolution has led to ideologies that have been so destructive to the human race.
It's been misunderstood. I mean, even Hitler could be described as a misunderstanding of Darwinism, and that's a grotesque and horrible
eugenicists,
yeah.
and those in favor of euthanasia, and those in favor of infanticide.
But wouldn't it be a good idea, instead of pointing to misperceptions of Darwinism, which have been hideously misused politically, if you try to understand Darwinism, then you'd be in a position to counteract these horrible misunderstandings.
Actually, we are oftentimes forced by the aggressiveness of those who favor evolution. It's not as if we are hidden from this information that you keep presenting. It's not as if it's unknown to us because we can't get away from it. It's pushed on us all the time. But I think your frustration comes from the fact that so many of us who have seen your information still don't buy into your ideology.
Have you seen Homo erectus? Have you seen Homo habilis? Have you seen Australopithecus?
What is all this homo?
What I've seen is that in the museums and in the textbooks, that whenever they claim that to show the evolution from one species to another, it relies on illustrations and drawings, not any material evidence.
You might have to go to the Nairobi Museum to see the original fossils, but do you believe that the world is young, for example? Do you believe the world is less than 10,000 years old?
Yeah.
Well,
this is
and the time
like there we go. Our ancestors are at least 35,000 years old, right? Like, so you're already wrong, bro. What the
frame it can be unknown. As we look in the Bible, it's hard to know what a day, the length of time that might mean in that context. So when I go back to those, the human being, because that's like what I think we really care about, are human beings. And are human beings created through the loving touch of a creator, or just came out of slime?
Well, if you were to talk to a bishop, the bishop would probably say, yes, human beings were created by a loving creator, but he used evolution in order to do it.
guys, you guys are made in, how do I say, image of me. Is that a good explanation? Like, I created because I wanted to communicate with like, I was bored and I was alone and I wanted to have this whole thing, a fucking video game. This is a video game you are playing. So yeah.
The position of the Archbishop of Canterbury.
And that does show that there's a variety of opinions across the board among those who may not buy completely into the hardcore ideas of evolution. There are those who believe in different levels of evolution within creation, and that really shows kind of a creative independence within our movement that seems to be a bit lacking among those who believe in evolution and only evolution.
But as I've just told you, there are bishops who believe in evolution. Indeed, just about all bishops believe in evolution. And they would say...
You would have to clarify what denomination of bishops, to say a broad term like that.
Well, the ones I'm familiar with are Anglican and
there you go.
Catholic, but that's okay. I mean, there are certainly lots of very, very senior church people who do believe in evolution, and so there is a broad... I mean, there are those, and there are others who are not bishops, but who are scientists or also Christian, or also Jews, and who... believe in evolution, but who think that the idea of God kind of intervening in this sort of conjuring trick way is rather blasphemous. I mean, I know evolutionist colleagues who are also devout Christians who think that it's to the greater glory of God to study the way science actually is, rather than to try to bring God in as a kind of magician who kind of, waves a wand and things happen.
Yeah, and I think and that is a misinterpretation, misframing of what we believe. We believe that God can and does intervene. throughout history and in life. And we see that as like a loving father that's involved in his family and his children. It's not that the father is dictating everything to his children, what they can and cannot do. As a Christian, I believe in free will. God created us with the ability to
See,
make our own
first thing is
decisions.
that
Some
you
of
have
those decisions are
limited
bad
free will. Like, it's not like you got ultimate free will. Yeah, you have a very limited amount of free will. All of you have a limit. Like, you can do certain things on this planet. You can't go out of the system to change your fucking thing, right? Second point was the loving father one, right? So yeah, I'm intervening. This is exactly what I'm trying to do. I'm intervening in your fucking politics, in your religion, everything. You know, that's why I'm back, motherfucker.
Everything to his children, what they can and cannot do. As a Christian, I believe in free will. God created us with the ability to make our own decisions. Some of those decisions are bad decisions, some are good.
Yeah, limited,
to say
limited.
that God intervenes in our lives, even in the creation, well, perhaps even especially in the creation of our life, is reflecting a belief in a very loving God.
Yes, and there are others who say that God set up the laws of physics, the laws of the universe, and he did it in such a cunning way that when the time came, evolution got going and eventually produced us. Isn't that a rather grand and noble vision?
It is, and in fact, we believe that as well. We believe that science is unlocking the mysteries of the laws put in place by God, that God created this earth with certain laws like the law of gravity to allow it to function. And
it's a very fine-tuned program. Don't you see that?
Is
Are you blind,
and
Richard?
unlocking the secrets of the laws that
Such
God
a
put in place.
fine-tuned planet.
Which are evolution, which follows from the laws of chemistry and physics under the right conditions. So that could be the working out of God's purpose. Could evolution be the working out of God's purpose?
And there are many people who do believe that God does use a form of creation where evolution is a part of that. The evolution of back up on that. That there are many people who do believe that God intervenes in this world and uses various laws like gravity or progression to create a more stable world, a better world.
Yes.
So I don't think that there is much. I don't think there should be as much dissension between our camps. That we can come to respect one another. In fact, we do. We respect evolutionists for their beliefs. What we would hope is that there would be as much respect on the evolutionist part toward us so that we could have a dialogue without being reduced to ad hominem attacks and accusing others of having hidden, secret, hostile agendas.
Yeah.
I don't want to be respected for my beliefs. I want you to respect the facts. I want you to look at the facts. Don't respect me. I don't want respect.
Richard, how about you look at the facts? You know, how about you look at the facts that I can create earthquake anytime? You know, how about you can look at the fact that I called Indra? You know what Indra is? You don't know shit, bro. Like, what can I tell you? You know, the guy who can bring rain anytime on the planet, right? Like, I can talk to him. I can bring him today, right now, right? Like, if I wanted, I can get a fucking, what do you say, that fucking rain thing now.
Museums and look at the facts.
You can see those facts on my YouTube. You know, you don't have to go far.
That there is no evidence.
Just check my YouTube, bro.
Yes, and then what I would say.
I mean, really, go and I've told you about hominid fossils. You can go and look at the evolution of the horse. You can go and look at the evolution of the early mammals. You can go and look at the evolution of fish. You can go and look at the transition from fish to land-living amphibians and reptiles. Any of those things you'll find in any good museum. Just open your eyes and look at the facts.
And I would say open your eyes and see the communities that have been built by those who believe in a loving God who created each one of us. And what I find is that is the kind of world that most of us would want to live in. One in which there is a deep respect for other human beings because they were created by a loving God. However that creation came about, you can have your beliefs, we can have our beliefs, and both can be based on different on evidence, even the same evidence. But I think fundamentally, where our differences come down to is whether there was a creator or whether there is not a creator.
I liked one phrase you used there. You talked about the sort of society in which we wish to live. And I'll tell you quite freely that a society based upon Darwinian principles is exactly the sort of society I do not wish to live in. It would be a terrible society. It would be a sort of George Bush kind of society, if I can put it like that, or Margaret Thatcher kind of society. I do not wish to live in a Darwinian world. I do, however, respect facts, and I do recognize that the facts of science show that the world of nature is a Darwinian world. It's a very unpleasant world.
It's not, bro. You're mistaken, you know.
Not the kind of world we wish to live in. So let us understand it so that we can construct the kind of society in which we wish to live, which will be a non-Darwinian society. It will be the sort of society which departs from Darwinian principles. A society that was based on Darwinian principles would be a ruthless free market economy.
Why you Americans don't eat horse? You know, there is a horse, breed of horse, right? Like you can eat horse meat, right? You don't eat horse meat, right? You don't eat dog, you don't eat cats, but you eat other animals, right? So look at the hypocrisy of you fucking humans. And there are the rules and there are laws. Don't eat cows, you motherfucker. Don't eat cat, don't eat like things that give you milk, because that's these moral things are what God wanted you to follow, but you don't listen to me, and that's the problem.
Trample the poor, in which it would be sort of opposite of a liberal socialist society, in fact. In a way, I'm rather surprised, if we're talking politics, that the right wing in America is so hostile to Darwin. If we're going to be naive about applying science to politics, you ought to be in favor of Darwin. I'm against Darwin where politics is concerned, but you cannot argue with scientific facts.
You actually have to make my case quite well, and that is that a philosophy that is drawn out of Darwinism would be extremely brutal, and in fact has been. That has been the experience.
I've just said that. I've agreed with that.
And that's why the societies that have been built on a viewpoint that God created each one of us, however he did it, that's part of the science of unlocking, of discovering how that was done.
Yeah, so I can explain you how it was done. All right, so now I've done this in my previous videos. I'm doing it again for new people, you know. So the same way you can code on a computer any program, right? It's with zeros and one. I created this whole universe with 0 to 9. It's a very straightforward thing. You can create the fucking video game with zeros and ones. I can create the universe with zeros and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So because a bigger code, like it's a fucking code. Like it's like fucking mathematics. Everything is mathematics. You don't get it.
Loving creator helps to build a
The
society.
human body is also made of mathematics. That's just fucking numbers.
At Concerned Women for America, we have state chapters and even more local chapters. And one of the things they've been involved
It's all
in is
coded
the debate
reality, guys. It's all
teaching
virtual
evolution or
reality we live
intelligent
in.
design
It's like a
in
video game.
schoolrooms. And the
Our
position
bodies
we've
are
taken
fucking
is teach
virtual
the
bodies.
controversy.
You know, it's not
Teach
as
all the
real as you think it
information,
is.
not just selected information that promotes one viewpoint, which most of the times that's evolution. But let's teach all the information so that the school children can learn how to think for themselves and come to their own conclusions.
Nobody could possibly object to teaching children to think for themselves.
I wish that were the case, that people would not object to teaching all the information or teaching children in a manner so they can think for themselves. But sadly, there's been a very heavy-handed effort in the United States to clamp down, not allow any teaching that is contrary to evolution, even to the point of court orders.
Wow.
When you say teach the controversy, it would be nice. I mean, of course, scientists teach controversies all the time. There's a lot of controversy in science. There's evidence on one side, there's evidence on the other side. In this case, however, we have a very large amount of evidence in favor of evolution. But the evidence on the other side is not evidence in favor of anything else. It's actually looking for little gaps and looking for little things that allegedly evolution can't explain. Say, look, we found something they can't explain.
I'll just follow my channel. I'll give you more evidence, guys. Don't worry about it. Fucking, I'll give you more evidence very soon.
Then scientists should be in favor of teaching evidence, even if they may discount the evidence, even if they think it's inconsequential. as a scientist, scientists should be committed to teaching truth.
Yes, but I think you didn't understand what I said. I said on the one side there is evidence, on the other side there is a looking for apparent lack of evidence. There is no positive.
But that is what
evidence.
science is about. Science is taking a theory and challenging it to see if it can stand up.
That's right.
And so while people may not like when the evidence doesn't stand up to further testing, but that's what science is about.
Yes, well, that is what science is about. But there are no cases known to me, at least, where science, where it doesn't stand up. I mean, there are cases where work needs to be done, and of course, science flourishes on finding places where more work needs to be done. That's how science advances.
As you mentioned, what's known to you. And I think that's why we need variety of people looking at theories and challenging it. Because if it's one person who's dictating what can be challenged or can't, or what evidence is substantial or not, then we have a dictatorship. In science, scientists should be free to challenge.
By nature, because I'm the creator of the planet on the universe, by nature I'm a dictator. All right, so I'm sorry about that, but that's how it is. I'm the dictator, the real dictator.
Theories, and not be hemmed in, not be restricted by the current zeitgeist of those who are the almost the high priests of science of that
of course
day.
Is right. I mean, I agree with that. But can you point to any positive scientific evidence in favor of creation?
Yes, I can.
I think the fact, as you pointed out, DNA. I think DNA helps to show that each one of us are individuals, and
yes, but they have to be individuals for evolution to work. I mean,
I don't think that's the case. I think that the fact that each one of us are distinct, that no two of us are exactly alike, that helps to show that there is some intervention at the point of each person's creation.
Do you know about the Darwinian theory that it's about individual variation being selected? There has to be individual variation or Darwinism wouldn't work.
What also seems to be shown in the scientific evidence is that mutations die out, and we don't have good evidence of positive mutations being the ones that are then built on, because if they're a mutation, they're alone. So in order for something to rise up and have more of it, you need to have a good base to choose from. For example, a recessive gene in a person. Both parents may have brown eyes, and yet a child may have blue eyes. And that's because there's enough of the gene in their ancestors to have brought out that recessive gene.
And that's evidence against evolution.
I think that helps to show the individual nature of each person. That God created us with genes, with DNA, and that He'll even use that to show His creative element in each person. The fact that you can have two people, a man and a woman, could have 13 children, 16 children, and each one is completely distinct from one another. That shows that even though they came from a common parentage, that yet there's still a creative element for each one of those human beings.
Do you actually know what Darwin's theory of natural selection is?
I think I know enough, because it gets pounded into us by those who simply won't allow for other information, that don't want other information to come forward.
I won't do any pounding, but just let me tell you what it is. There is individual variation. Every individual, apart from monozygotic twins, is different from every other individual. That's absolutely fundamental to the Darwinian theory. Now, what happens is that among that variety of individuals, some survive better than others, some reproduce better than others. That's how we get evolution. You couldn't have evolution unless there was individual variation. You must not keep thinking that because there's individual variation, that's somehow evidence against evolution.
So I come back to you, and why do you reject the idea that there is a creator who's involved in the creation of human beings, whether it was the initial creation and then he left, or is involved in the creation of each human being who's ever lived on Earth?
Well, as I've said, there are plenty of ways in which God could be involved in creation of the universe, in creation of life, but Darwinian natural selection demands individual variation. That's why you must stop using individual variation as evidence against evolution. It's evidence for evolution.
Once I was going through the Smithsonian Natural History Museum with dear relatives of mine, and one of them was a severely handicapped little girl who can't do anything for herself. She can't talk, she can't walk, she can't feed herself, she can barely sit up. And when one of the people I was with turned to me and said, "Do you believe in evolution?" And I said, "I think this little girl is a perfect example of why evolution is wrong. Because here's someone who cannot take care of herself, and yet she has a spirit. She's not just a material being." And that's one difference I find between the ideology of Darwinism and evolution and those who believe in a loving God is the idea of a spirit and a soul that is not material. And it's something that it makes us distinct from animals.
Do you think that children should be taught critical thinking at school?
In fact, that is
See,
what
guys,
we argue.
even animals have souls, birds have souls, trees have souls. Everything, the whole fucking thing, everything has my involvement in it, right? Like even the fucking stone has me inside it. So that's how it is, right? Like the whole fucking thing need to understand this fucking thing, that the sun, moon, rivers, water, mountain, everything has the fucking element of God in it. You fucking idiots.
Before is that children to
Everything
be
is
taught,
alive. The universe is
evidence,
alive, guys.
so that they can decide for themselves, so they can figure out for themselves what is truth.
Right. Do you understand what I was saying when I was explaining about natural selection requiring individual variation?
I do, but I also come back and I haven't heard you answer whether you have a problem with this idea of God being involved in the creation of each individual human being, not just perhaps being the one that got it all started.
Well, I do have a problem with that because I've seen the evidence and I know that individual variation comes from genetics, it comes from DNA, and I know where it comes from. And it's a very well worked out story. It's in every textbook. I mean, we differ because we have different genes.
And do you
genes. Sorry, go on.
Do you believe in a spirit or a soul?
I believe in a spirit or a soul in the sense of my own consciousness, which is a manifestation of my neurons and my brain physiology. I don't believe I have an immortal soul, but that's my personal belief.
And what about a disabled person who is severely mentally disabled and is not able to make choices? Do they have a spirit? Are they a human being?
They're a human being. They belong to the species Homo sapiens. Their ancestry is Homo sapiens, so of course they're human beings, yes.
And do they have a spirit or a soul?
It's not a meaningful word. They have a spirit or a soul in just the same sense as I have. But I only have a spirit or a soul in a very much different meaning than yours.
So how do you prove reincarnation? Or you don't even believe in that? But there is evidence, right? Like children who remember their past life, you will find them in America, everywhere, you know? Do you have any answer for that, Richard? Or you have no answer for
I
that?
understood you to say it's because of your conscious, or even your consciousness, which would be different things. But
people who remember their past
someone,
lives, you know?
who is not capable of making decisions, do they have a spirit or a soul?
Well, if you mean somebody whose brain is so disabled that they have no consciousness at all, then they have no consciousness. I've answered your question.
Well, no.
So then he doesn't have a
spirit or a soul.
That's
is
stupid,
different.
Richard.
That's your word. It's not a word that I acknowledge or recognize as a meaningful word.
Then from what I understand, you're saying then if someone does not have the ability to be conscious, then they would not have a spirit or soul.
A human placenta is a identical twin to the baby that it nourished. I don't think either of us would wish to say that it has a spirit or a soul because it doesn't have a brain.
So
when the baby is a placenta and then it grow and grow and grow, so there is a time when the soul enters the body, and I can prove you that, right? Like it is in my text. I've written that. I've like 20,000 years ago in Vedas, you know. I'll show you that later on.
Well, going back up on that, it's the material, the matter, the brain, or the consciousness. Let me back there because those are two separate things. I guess I'm confused in what you're saying. That a brain means you have a soul. A consciousness means you have a soul. But someone whose brain is not functioning, would they then not have a soul?
someone who didn't have a brain that was capable of consciousness, somebody who's a human vegetable in effect, would not have the properties that you call a soul and that I might call a soul for the sake of argument, but I don't think it's immortal. That's the main difference between us.
And I think that's very key, because that then would work out in how you and I, or someone who believes like you do and someone who believes like I do, would treat someone who is in what's been called I think it's a horrible term, but a vegetative state. That we would still treat that human being as a person who's deserving of loving respect, that should be fed and cared for, even though they can't for themselves.
How would you treat a chimpanzee who was in full command of her faculties?
Yes, and that's where we would differ. We believe that human beings have souls, have spirits, and that animals should absolutely are cared for. That's a great teaching that comes from our beliefs that we care for animals. But we recognize that there's a difference between animals and humans, and one of the differences is as spirit.
When you use the word "we" quite often for people who think like you, so would it be right that the CWA is part of a sort of wider constituency within America?
Yes, we represent 500,000 ourselves, but that's just a drop in the bucket of the number of people who believe similarly. And we find that as these challenges come up, say in school districts, that there are a number of parents and families and communities who will rise up in concern over the fact that only evolution is allowed to be taught, and not the questioning of evolution. So it's quite widespread in the United States. The belief that human beings are distinct is a widespread belief in the United States. And that's remarkable, because evolution has been so heavily taught in the last number of decades. And the fact that it's being taught so strongly and isolated from other information or evidence. And yet, many people continue to believe that God has a hand in creating us, I think helps to show that people are using their critical factories. They're not just believing what's being taught in the schools. And that evolutionism is going to continue to have a bit of a challenge here in the United States and beyond.
I've been reading your website, and I get the feeling there's almost a feeling of sort of persecution. I mean, as though somehow you feel that the establishment in the United States is against Christianity. That puzzles me a bit, because I mean, you've got the White House, you've got the Supreme Court, you've got you had both houses of Congress until quite recently. How can you feel persecuted in the face of this overwhelming Christian dominance in the United States?
Yeah. Many Christians have experienced the hostility toward our beliefs, but beyond hostility, the attempts to even censor and punish us for our beliefs. And the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, that we must continue to fight for our freedom in order to have it. And even though some may believe that the three branches of government reflect our views, that's not necessarily the case. But let me give you my own experiences. A number of years ago, I was praying in public across the street from an abortion clinic, and was sentenced to 6 months in jail for simply praying. It's these kinds of experiences.
Excuse me, you were sentenced to 6 months in jail for praying?
For praying.
Wow.
Could we get a bit more detail about
Sure. A judge had signed an injunction stating that certain things could not be done within 100 feet of abortion clinics in that city, in Houston. And so 4 of us knelt and prayed across the street from the clinic, and the judge sentenced us to 6 months in jail and a $500 fine.
What law was that?
It was an injunction, and an injunction is essentially a judge-made law. It only applies to certain people. I was not named on the injunction, and yet the judge found me guilty of it. Thankfully, she was overturned by a higher court. But there are experiences like that throughout the United States, where certain people are told and punished for acting out their beliefs. And it's those kinds of cases that make us very sensitive to protecting all of our liberties.
I can't help feeling the context must have been. Had that abortion clinic been threatened with
No, in
or
fact,
anything like that?
no, it had none. It had not. There were protests that were going on during that time. Now, the abortion clinic had argued to the judge that women would be intimidated from coming into the clinic if there were protesters outside. Well, at the same time that 4 of us were quietly quietly kneeling in prayer with no signs or anything like that. There were about 100 pro-abortion demonstrators in front of the clinic, blocking the entrance, screaming and yelling with signs and bullhorns. But it was those of us who were quietly kneeling in prayer who were sentenced to 6 months in jail. So I think maybe you can understand then why we are so sensitive to wanting to protect our religious freedoms and the ability to act on our consciences, because we do have cases like this where people have been punished for acting on their beliefs.
Yes, I can't comment on a particular anecdote like that, of course. Just want to come back one more time to the idea of teaching the controversy. In science, we're well used to controversy, and we have controversy all the time. Since Darwin's time, plenty of things that Darwin thought have now been shown to be wrong. I mean, Darwin was completely wrong about genetics, for example. And so there are modern controversies in Darwinism. There are controversies between people who think that natural selection is all important in driving evolution. And there are people who think that natural selection is only part of it, and that there are other things that drive evolution. Nobody seriously doubts the fact of evolution, but there are controversies about whether evolution is largely driven by natural selection or only partly driven by natural selection. For example, there are controversies about whether evolution goes smoothly and continuously, or whether it goes in jumps, whether there are sort of long periods where not much evolution happens, and then a rather sudden burst of evolution, which represent a kind of step in the fossil record. Those are genuine controversies, and of course it's extremely right and proper that children should be taught those controversies. But when you say teach the controversy, by which I think you mean the controversy between science on the one hand and probably biblical creation on the other, there are lots of creation myths. I mean, the Genesis myth just happens to be the Babylonian Jewish myth, which for historical accident reasons is largely prevalent in the United States.
I will show you the truth, guys. Just
the
wait.
Hindu myth that we're the product of a cosmic butter churn, or an Australian Aboriginal myth that we come from the dream time. Why pick on the Judeo-Christian Babylonian myth?
What we have argued when we say teach the controversies in evolution, and to teach the evidence that shows intelligent design. I'm not aware of people arguing that that in public schools it ought to be taught the biblical accounts of creation. So when we say teach the controversy, we mean teach all the evidence that, including the evidence that goes against evolution. Teach the evidence for intelligent design.
Who do you think the intelligent designer was?
I am.
Well, see, that's something that I think scientists can debate. But the idea that there was an intelligent design to the process. In fact, what you've mentioned regarding even natural selection, and that there could be somebody or something that put all these laws in place that now the world is operating off of, does back up this idea that there was an intelligent being that caused all this, the whole world, to happen.
Yes, I mean that's what a bishop might say. I wouldn't say that, but there are plenty of Christians who would say that. Wouldn't your life be a lot easier if you went along with the bishops and said the evidence in favor of the fact of evolution is overwhelming, so let's accept it and bring God in there?
I think one issue is this idea that that we take orders from a hierarchy.
Okay, no,
and there are some bishops that believe like you do, and there are other bishops that don't, that believe differently. Yes. And so it's easy to select those who believe like you do and rely wholly as if they speak for everyone. Yes. But those bishops don't speak for all Christian
leaders. I accept that, and I would hate to suggest that you take orders from authority. I do want you to look at the facts a bit more, though. I mean, they are actually very interesting.
I'll show you the facts, guys. Wait. I'm waiting for you to finish, then I'll show you the real facts. The honest truth about the fucking planet.
That we don't read. That we don't read books. Or that we don't know what evolution is, when in fact most of us have been through the museums that you and your folks have put together. Yes. It probably would be helpful to the dialogue if the evolutionists were not so demeaning and degrading to others, and again, I kind of go back to perhaps that comes out of the philosophy of evolution, that some people are better than others.
You said there was no evidence of intermediates in evolution, and I told you about 5 fossils.
And what I say, if that were if those were valid, there would be tons of evidence because there are so many different species that there ought to be tons of evidence. Even let's say for 1% of the macroevolution that's taken place, there should be evidence. But there's not even 1%, let alone 10 or 50 or 70%.
There is a massive amount of evidence. You just need to go into the books and go into the museums and look at it. It's there.
Yes, and
You're believing people
we
who
have
are telling you there's only 1%.
Oh, and again, I go back to it's very demeaning to say that we only believe what we believe because we've been told that, and yet we have evolutionary scientists who want to be the ones to tell all of society what is fact and what's not fact, and to censor out information that is inconvenient.
I'm asking you to go and look at the facts. I don't want you to believe me. Just go and look at the facts.
Yes, and I have, and again I go back to let's look at the differences of what your philosophy lives out, the evolutionary philosophy, and how does that end up working out in a society?
I've accepted that if we worked out society on Darwinian grounds, it would be a very, very unpleasant right-wing society. I've accepted that.
Well, I don't know right-wing. It seems to be that you fall back on ad hominem, name-calling.
All right, then, free market.
Even
ruthless trampling on the poor. That's what it would be like.
What I find interesting, though, is
a Darwinian society. I don't want a Darwinian society.
Communism was based on atheistic beliefs and evolutionary beliefs, and communism resulted in a decade that had more deaths, over 100 million deaths committed because of communism, than all the killings combined of every century prior to that. So when
it's not true, but
socialism,
Islamists have killed more Hindus in India, right?
Being a better way of life. I look back on what beliefs was communism and socialism based on, and the atheistic belief that human beings are not distinct and should not be respected.
When you say distinct, do you mean distinct from each other, or do you mean when human beings are not distinct from each other?
That human beings are created as distinct from one another and should be treated with respect, even if they are not utilitarian, even if they are not able to provide something to society. The atheistic belief, the evolutionary belief, is that you're unnecessary and unneeded if you cannot provide something for society.
That's an extraordinary thing to say. I mean, you equated atheistic with evolutionary. That means that's wiping out most of the bishops. They wouldn't take very kindly to that.
I've recognized that there are varying degrees within the evolutionary beliefs. It's the hardcore evolutionists that reject the idea of a creator that then pave the foundation for very brutal societies.
Well, I have accepted that if we were to base our societies on Darwinian principles, they would be brutal, harsh, and unpleasant. I have told you that I want not to live in a Darwinian society. I've suggested to you that it might be a good idea to learn something about Darwinism so as to know what to avoid in setting up society.
And it would be helpful to learn
truth is what you're avoiding, bro.
That make successful and healthy society. And let's build on those characteristics.
I agree with that, and among those characteristics would be critical thinking, a respect for education, a respect for evidence.
And a respect for human beings.
And a respect for human beings, very much so.
Regardless of whether they can provide for society or provide something to society.
Indeed. That's the essence of the liberal philosophy which I espouse, that human beings should be respected, their health should be taken care of.
Even if they don't have a functioning brain that is conscious.
They should be given, their hospital care should be taken care of by the state. That's a liberal principle which I espouse. It's an un-Darwinian principle.
I believe that it's not a state, because a state is an institution or an entity. It's human beings that provide care for others.
well, okay, human beings provide care for others. None of that bears on the truth of whether evolution actually happened. And that is a matter of fact. It's like gravity. You can't get away from fact. Study the fact, learn the facts, and then make up the society that you want to live in on the basis of the facts as they are.
Yeah, and the facts that would include what makes the better society is one where there is deep respect for each human being, and a way to inculcate
for each human.
And the way to inculcate respect for human beings is by seeing that they were created.
So you would you actually distort the scientific fact in order to create respect?
There's no need to distort, because, as I mentioned, science is a technique, a tactic for discovering and unlocking the keys of how this world works. And so we don't need to deny any facts, because the facts end up bearing out our beliefs. So sometimes it takes time for science to catch up with the beliefs that have made the best societies. Sometimes it takes a while for science they may stumble across something and take the wrong interpretation from it and build a philosophy on it, and then later realize, oops, that wasn't correct. So science oftentimes changes its own beliefs based on new evidence.
Quite often it does, isn't it?
But oftentimes what ends up happening is, as science progresses, it backs up the belief that there's an intelligent designer.
Science proceeds by what the philosopher Karl Popper called conjectures and refutations. So you have an idea, you have a hypothesis, and then you see if you can refute it. And a theory is, a well-substantiated theory is always one that has yet to be refuted. So the more a theory has been attempted to be refuted and has yet to come through with flying colours, the more accepted it is. And after a point, de facto, it gets called a fact. The theory that the Earth goes round the sun is only a theory. It's only a theory, but it's never been refuted, and we all know it never will be refuted. That's how science proceeds. It's conjecture and refutation. That's the state that evolution is in. It's a bit like the theory that the Earth goes around the sun. It is only a theory. But to a scientist, that can mean, in this case does mean, that it's never been refuted. And the more it goes on from decade to decade to decade and is not refuted, the more closely does it approximate to what everybody calls a fact.
Then evolutionists should have no problem with there being questioning of it and challenging of it, and to be willing to teach the challenges to it, to be willing to talk about the evidence against it. And that's where I find the hardcore evolutionists have a bit of a problem. It's like an oak tree in a storm. Because it is so rigid, it's more likely to then fall and break, whereas those that are more open to being challenged can then bend with the facts that come forward. So that's why what many of us in the United States are arguing for: teach the controversies in the schools. Allow the information that shows the flaws in evolution to be taught. Don't blackball scientists who may not agree wholeheartedly with the hardcore version of evolution to be blackballed out of the profession. Allow people to have enough respect for people to allow them to have all the information so they can make up their own minds.
It's a difficult question, this thing about blackballing. I agree. It's a nasty idea to blackball.
Yes.
What about somebody who's teaching geography, who believes in the flat Earth? Would you blackball them?
Well, always extreme cases are used. That's not what we're facing here in the United States. What we're facing are scientists who may not agree wholeheartedly with the hardcore view of evolution, who do believe in intelligent design. They're being denied their careers. They're being denied. So it's better to argue from the facts of what's happening rather than some hypothetical.
Okay. Let's take intelligent design. The leading intelligent design proponents in this country believe in evolution. They believe that we're cousins of chimpanzees, we're cousins of kangaroos, etc.
Bro, we are, don't include me in that, all right?
They believe in evolution, but they believe that God, as it were, helped evolution over the difficult jumps. There are some things that they call irreducibly complex, which and scientists dispute that they're irreducibly complex. But the point is, they do believe in evolution. They do believe that we're descended from reptiles, for
No,
example.
you are, bro, not everybody
They think
else,
that God helped over certain of the difficult stages.
So it would be wonderful to interview them and let them speak for themselves, present their information and their evidence.
Yes.
And to show that there are a variety of views. And that's why the hardcore evolutionists should not have a monopoly on what is allowed to be discussed or researched in science.
Would you accept, well, nobody's going to make any restriction on what you're allowed to research, of course.
Well, that's done, of course, through funding, through grants, through positions at universities. There are ways to restrict what can and can't be researched.
I mean, funding of scientific research is always a problem, and all scientists have a time when they grumble about not getting funding. I mean, you do have to, you're competing in a marketplace, and the NSF and other grant-giving bodies have to give money where peer review suggests it's going to be most useful. I mean, that is definitely a problem, of course. Would you accept that what you call teaching the controversy should be done in classes of religion or classes of history of ideas, rather than classes of science?
Teaching the controversy refers to teaching the evidence and the facts that dispute evolution. So it should be taught in the science classes because it's teaching evidence.
Yes, I mean, when I asked you about evidence, you said there are no fossil intermediates, and when I told you about fossil intermediates, you changed the subject. I mean,
no, when I don't change the subject, what I say is that if there were, if there had been evolution from slime to human beings, that there'd be a massive amount of evolution. If there was evidence of going from slime to human beings, there'd be a massive amount of evidence showing interspecies from one macro species to another. And that's where I find the concept of evolution lacking. And so the burden really is on the evolutionists. Oftentimes it's been thrown back at us that we just need to look at the information. But let me throw it back on you all to say, look, this is what's needed to convince us. So you need to come up with a large amount of evidence to back up this claim that there's been a large progression of macroevolution throughout the years.
Yes. How are we going to make you look at it there? Because, I mean, I told you.
Well, no. We look at it. We look at it. Again, when I go back to, it's easy to blame the other person. To say and to blame by saying that we're ignorant. But what I'm saying to you is if there were enough evidence, it would convince it will convince those who are open to the information. There's such a vast number of people in the United States and elsewhere who do believe in an intelligent design, that there's a creator. If there was a vast amount of evidence, solid evidence to back up evolution, that would influence a significant number of the vast number of people who believe in intelligent design.
That sends me close to despair because the evidence is there. I mean, I keep telling you about it. Just let me tell you some of it. There is evidence of, for example, the transition from fish coming out of the water onto the land. It's beautiful evidence. It's elegant.
Yeah. It's very elegant, right? Like, जो तुम्हारा बाप है मत्स्य अवतार बन के भी आया हुआ है. So that happened fucking, I don't know how many thousands of years ago. You need to understand fucking what I'm trying to say.
Go to Philadelphia and have a look at the wonderful fossil they've got there. I'm sure they have replicas in the Smithsonian here. Just look at that evidence. It's beautiful. The evidence for the transition between the reptilian jaw and the mammalian jaw. The reptilian jaw has several bones. The mammalian lower jaw has only one bone. And the other bones that were in the reptile have now moved into the inner ear. It's a beautiful transition.
So what is your cause in life? I would think that if your cause was to convince others that evolution is correct, not just a theory, but a fact, then you'd be devoting yourself to finding this information and making it readily available. What I find is that you're spending a lot of time arguing with me, trying to convince me, instead of showing the evidence or spending your time producing evidence.
Was I not just telling you about fish that are intermediate between the sea?
But again, what I go back to is if there was a large enough amount of evidence, which there should be. If we have gone from slime to human beings, there should be an overwhelming amount of evidence, not these isolated cases that could be interpreted differently. And see, one problem that evolutionists have is that in the past, when there's been great acclaim of a discovery to show from one another, in their own history.
A
The
big
fact
problem.
that there have been so many cases of fraud or misinterpretation of information that now we have a problem believing what you say.
There was the Piltdown Man in the 1920s. I suggest we forget about the 1920s and look at today. Go and look at some modern paleontology labs. Go and talk to some modern paleontologists. Go and talk to the people who are looking at the transition from fish to amphibians.
I'll show you. Give me 5 minutes, guys.
For
I'll show you.
instance, about the human transition. Look at the evolution of the horse. Look at the evolution of the elephant. There are evolution of the whale. There are so many beautiful stories. I mean, you'd be fascinated. You would think that these fossil histories are to the greater glory of
Oh.
So would it make you happy if we were to agree that there is some evidence regarding macroevolution? Would that alone make you happy, or would you still be unhappy and feel that your cause is unsuccessful if many of us still believe that there's an intelligent being who caused this to happen?
It would make me enormously happy. I would love it. If you said, yes, evolution is obviously a fact, I accept evolution, but God did it. I mean, that wouldn't, I wouldn't agree with that, but it would make me hugely happy. At least you looked at the evidence.
And I don't understand why that's so important to you, that I believe exactly like you believe.
No, it's not important to me. I am an educator. I'm a scientist. I'm a university professor. I teach. I love it when people see the beauty of nature, the beauty of evidence, and just look at it and appreciate how elegant it is. It really is beautiful. Go and look at it.
What is the danger in believing in an intelligent designer?
I don't think that's a danger. Well, as an atheist, which I am, a very strong atheist, I have a quite separate agenda. That is an agenda, but it's not my agenda as a science educator. I'm now talking purely as a scientist and a science educator, and I am distressed that somebody as intelligent as you is refusing to look at the evidence.
And what is your agenda as an atheist? Because that is going to influence the work that you do.
Well, I like to think it's not actually, but whatever I might say about that, I've done another television program about that, and I was a very strong atheist in that program. This program is about Darwin, and there are many Darwinians who are not atheists, and all I'm talking about now is the factual evidence, and I'm suggesting to you that you might do a better job for your religion if you would open your mind to the factual evidence and realize that actually you could use the genuine scientific factual evidence to the greater glory of your God, rather than running away from the evidence.
But again, that's where we differ. We don't believe we are running away from the evidence. And what we are seeking to do is to help people to understand who God is, that he's a loving God. And part of his love toward us is that he created us. The fact that he wanted us to exist.
Maybe he did it via evolution, though.
And the helping people to understand that there's a God who's created order in this universe, and that there are certain, as you've mentioned, laws in this universe. That even includes moral laws of how we are to treat one another. The work that we're working toward is helping people to understand these moral laws and live according to these moral laws, because not only will they benefit living healthier and happier lives, but our society will as well. And so each of the work that we do through Concerned Women for America is toward that end. Now, you have your own cause. You're going to devote your life to that. And I would hope that you could respect and appreciate the work that we're doing to help make society a better place by helping people to understand the moral laws not only exist, but they're the best for each one of us and as a society. And you can go to sleep at night happy, hopefully, knowing that we're being successful in our work, because it will make a better society, one that Darwin's beliefs would not have made.
Yes, well, I've gone into that, haven't I? I agree with you that Darwinian beliefs would not make for a good society. I've said they'll make for a bad.
And what's lacking, as you've mentioned, what's lacking is what's lacking in Darwin needs to be made up with somewhere else. The fact that Darwinian is would lead to such a harsh and brutal life means that there's a great need for other people to be making this world a better place.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can show some support by subscribing
All
to
right,
the
guys,
podcast,
I'll show him
sharing
some
it with your
evidence.
friends, and leaving a review.
Let me show you some evidence. So look at this, the fish story. Let me start the fish story. So where that fish story come from? You know the Noah fucking thing, that Noah, this is the fish story of the real fucking thing.
From destruction. This video will narrate you the story of the first incarnation of Vishnu. To know about all the 10 avatars of Vishnu, watch the playlist linked in the comments below.
That's your fish story of the planet.
The first avatar of Vishnu is in the form of a fish. Vishnu took the form of Matsya to rescue the Manu, the first man as per the Hindu epics from a huge destruction.
Manu, the word man comes from Manu. Manu is your real, like the first guy.
A river. While scooping in some water from the river to offer to Surya, the sun god, he accidentally caught a tiny fish in the palm of his hand. Satyavrat was ready to release the fish back into the water, but the fish requested otherwise. The tiny fish begged him not to throw it back into the river, as the river had bigger fishes that would prey upon it. To save itself from other predators of the sea, the fish requested the king to take it along with him to his palace, convincing him that his palace would be safe and big enough to accommodate a small fish. King Satyavrat took pity on the little fish and took it with himself to his palace. Upon reaching there, he put the fish in a small bowl. The king was happy and satisfied that he was able to save the life of this little being. The next morning, Satyavrat came to check on the fish and was surprised to see that the tiny fish he had brought with him had grown large enough to fill the entire pot. Its size had become so large that its movement inside the pot became restricted. The fish requested the king to place it in a larger vessel, as it would not be able to survive in this pot for long. The king agreed and transferred it to a larger vessel he had. But the same night, the fish had outgrown the size of this vessel too. The fish again requested the king to move it to a place big enough to ensure her survival. Satyavrat immediately ordered his servants to carry the fish into a pond. For the moment, it seemed like the fish would live there happily, but the next morning, Satyavrat was shocked to see the fish outgrow the size of the pond. This time, the king transferred the fish to the largest lake of his kingdom, but in no time, the fish outgrew the lake too. The king had no other option but to drop the fish into the ocean from where he originally rescued it. He apologized to the fish that despite being a king, he could not save her or provide her enough to ensure her survival. As the fish was dropped into the ocean, its size knew no bounds. It grew beyond what Satyavrat's eyes could see. At this point, Satyavrat concluded that this was no ordinary animal, but it had to be a divine appearance of God. Satyavrat bowed to the fish and apologized for thinking in his pride that he could save every living being on earth. He offered his prayers and requested the fish to reveal to him the ulterior motive behind this form. The Matsya took the form of Sri Vishnu and blessed Satyavrat. Matsya told the king that in 7 days a huge devastation in the form of flood would engulf the earth, killing almost all of the creation. Matsya ordered the king to call the 7 sages and gather samples of herbs, seeds, and all forms of life.
You remember that fucking Noah story? That's the real story.
Matsya promised Satyavrat that it would send a boat to save them, and with its help, they would be able to survive to begin the new cycle of Yuga. The king, upon understanding the orders of Matsya, began working on gathering everything as told to him. After 7 days, as Matsya had predicted, Huge clouds appeared in all directions and began pouring on land and sea. The huge waves from the ocean flowed into the land, becoming one with it. Soon there was no land in sight, and the entire earth was flooded in water. Then Satyavrat, with all his companions, saw a large mysterious boat floating towards them across the waves. Remembering the words of Matsya, Satyavrat onboarded the seven rishis, animals, all his belongings, and himself on the boat, finding some safety. Soon, Matsya appeared there with the snake Vasuki. Vasuki tied itself to the boat on one side and held on to the horns of Matsya on the other side. Matsya, with the help of Vasuki, towed the boat across the waters of devastation. For countless days, darkness covered the world, and they wandered across the stormy ocean, waiting for the waters to subside. During their journey and the days of patience, Vishnu, in the form of Matsya, preached King Satyavrata and the seven sages the spiritual knowledge of the Vedas. Satyavrat came to be known as Manu, the first man, and the seven sages who accompanied him became the Saptarishis, going on to repopulate the earth.
So you got the first story. Now I'll show you another story, which is also going to prove you clear a lot of fucking bullshit from your mind. Richard, oh Richard. Just a second, Richard. I'll show you that. No. So where the fetus get the fucking soul, when it gets the soul, the little placenta, how does it get the soul? Show you. Too much. I just want to do a quick one, Introduction.
प्रकट होता है
That's
और संपूर्ण जगत के कारणभूत जिन
one in English, guys. It's an audio book, guys. It's in English. So let's do this instead of that. When the soul enters the body, enters so anyway, guys, it's all
problem is as a physicist or as a chemist, we try and understand things which are not necessarily physical in terms of physical. So this is where we kind of get into complication. I did that myself. I was trying to understand the quantum by looking at two lumps of matter and how they're interconnected, and it doesn't work. It's a phenomenon that defies kind of very simplistic materialistic vision. So same is true with regarding reincarnation. First of all, this idea that reincarnation is for real, as you already explored, Ian Stevenson's research, etc., it is genuine. There is definitely a link between two lives. So the only way it can be explained is, according to Ian Stevenson, is through the theory of reincarnation of the Hindus, as well as David Hume of the Scottish philosopher. So this is, if you like, the credential we have. It's been well researched by academics, intellectuals, genuine people who have no other axe to grind. So that is for real. Now the issue is this. What is the mechanism that allows one individual to leave one body and then re-enter another womb and start the journey? That is basically not a physical phenomena, otherwise we're in big trouble. Otherwise we can really block somebody leaving the body and kind of capture it, put it in a jar. It's not a physical phenomena. The thing that is living within is essentially metaphysical, not physical. The physical part is your external garment. But if I can use the computer lingo, the software that you possess, the thing that makes you tick and make sense of the world, have cognition, cognition is essentially non-physical, just like software you and computer is non-physical, it's, scribbles. So in the same way, the metaphysical dimension that we possess does not have direct link, in the sense it cannot be captured through physical explanation. For example, you are suggesting whether it has to do with thermodynamic equilibrium. Okay. The only place where you can bring in a bit of thermodynamics in spiritual matters, including Hinduism, to simply say, one of the unique features about the creation we see is that entropy, disorder seems to be the name of the game. Everything goes from order to disorder. Living things are an exception. They seem to go from disorder to order. They kind of regular things. So this is the only thing I can say. It doesn't relate to reincarnation, but that's the only thing I can say about the thermodynamic equilibrium. So there is a special feature regarding all living things which allows us to go from disorder to order. This is the only thing I can suggest. Okay. Now, the process of reincarnation, the metaphysical dimension, suppose I try every kind of intellectual gymnastic, physics, etc., or chemistry, we will fail, because it is said is metaphysical. So it cannot be captured through any physical explanation, through thermodynamics or whatever. Now, how does a person, leave one body and go into another? We have a metaphysical aspect of our being. And in fact, the word metaphysics was invented to say not something woolly, but something greater than physical. That is what it literally means, meta, bigger than physical. So the metaphysical dimension we possess, which is our mental mode, our impression that we have collected, stays in kind of a different world. It's not a physical world. So that is the part that has got a momentum of its own, and then when a body comes to an end, it has a habit of carrying on with this momentum that is generated. Same in Buddhism. They say the impression that you created will carry you forward to the next life. They call it rebirth, we call it reincarnation. So the momentum it has got, the mental momentum it has generated as an individual cannot be snuffed out. So that finds re-expression in another body. How does it find another body? I think about these things as well.
Yeah. See, listen, I don't think this is good enough for Richard. He wants like evidence beyond the metaphysics. He wants the real fucking thing. So I don't know if this is fuck off, bro. I don't know. It is a good enough evidence, but anyway. But like the other evidence I can give is that I am proving you I can do metaphysical things, but you won't believe that. So what's the point? You want only physical fucking things, right? So I don't know, guys. How do I prove? Just a minute. How do you prove soul is real or not? All right, guys. Yeah.
Sure. So I'm a native New Yorker, and I did my BA and my MA at New York University. And then I completed my doctorate in philosophy at the State University of New York on Long Island. And then I spent a number of years teaching at a bunch of different colleges in the New York and New Jersey area, Greater Gotham, as I like to call it. And I taught philosophy, history of philosophy, ethics, comparative religion, political point, and also SDS, science, technology, and society. Before then, getting involved in some very unusual political machinations, which ultimately led to me being in the pages of the New York Times and Newsweek and so forth, which we can talk about.
Yeah, what was all that about? It seems like there was some sort of a campaign against you to smear you or discredit you that ended up on the front, or not the front page, but in the New York Times.
Yeah.
And inside of a bunch of different publications, and somehow the MI6 was involved in this?
Yeah, it's a long story, but I think actually it's an interesting one. So, and we have time. So
we do.
I'll unpack it for you. So I had written this doctoral dissertation, Prometheus and Atlas, in 2012 and received my doctorate for it in 2013. Then the book was expanded and published in 2016, right? So my first book, Prometheus and Atlas, which, by the way, it won the book award of the Parapsychological Association in 2016.
Oh, wow.
And this is relevant to the story I'm about to unfold for you, because right after that book came out, I, in a rather, I would say, meteoric fashion, became very well connected in the parapsychology community. among, very serious researchers, like people at the Society for Scientific Exploration, of which I became a member, and people at the Parapsychological Association. A lot of the folks that you've interviewed are connected to those same people. And, we're talking like Russell Targ, who I got to meet there at one of the PA conferences, and Hal Puthoff, of course, is a prominent member of the Society for Scientific Exploration. So I became well connected in those circles, and Prometheus and Atlas was hailed in those circles as, one of the most important, or if not the most important, parapsychological treatise for a long time. Even though I was coming at, parapsychological data from the standpoint of a philosopher who was interested in the deeper conceptual implications of these things. So point being, I'm very connected to these people, and in a way that I think is also going to wind up being relevant, a lot of these same people wound up central to the UFO disclosure movement as it has now, begun to unfold. And this is the milieu in my life so my book is published in February, and then in about, I would say, May or June of 2016, this guy from London reaches out to me, and he says, I kid you not, he is the British head of the British branch of the Vril Society. Now, the Vril Society were supposedly these occultists who created the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. Okay, they were like these barons and aristocrats in Austria and Germany, actually mostly based originally in Austria. Remember, Hitler was from Austria, not from Germany. And Baron Sabotendorf and his associates created this occult circle that had these female mediums involved with it, Maria Orsich and others. And they claimed to be channeling messages from, entities. Okay, and believe it or not, these people created the Nazi Party as a PAC, as a political action committee, in order to fight the rise of communism in Germany. Remember, Marx was a German. And even though the Soviet Union became the first bastion of communism, communism was born in Germany, and there was already a very strong communist contingent in the Weimar Republic. And these aristocrats, occultists, were not interested in seeing communism seize political power in Germany. So they created this political front, the Nazi Party, and hired somebody like Hitler, who was a good orator, to basically defend their interests, defend the interests of the aristocracy. And so the occultism of Nazism really is something that is brought in from the ground up, okay, as these people are setting up this society. So anyway, that's to give you a background. What's the Vril Society? And this guy reaches out to me. He goes,
so the Vril Society is basically like a modern spin-off of what was happening.
No. I mean, that's what they called it back then.
That's what they called it back then. So it's still active, it's still alive today.
Some people say it was called the Thule Gesellschaft, the Thule Society. Thule is the Germanic concept for Atlantis, the Germanic equivalent of Atlantis. So some people say it was called Thule Gesellschaft or Atlantis Society, and that it was organized around the idea of Vril. And some people say that the Thule Society spun off into the Vril Society. In any case, there was this thing back then. And this guy contacts me, and he says, I'm the head of the British branch of the Vril Society. Now, to put that in context for you, there were a lot of people at a high level in the British Parliament, in the House of Lords and so forth, even in the early 1940s, who wanted to make not just a détente with Hitler, but an alliance with the Nazis. And actually, Hitler made like 3 peace offers to these people to try to solicit the British Empire to come into some kind of strategic alliance with him. So point being, that there would be a British branch of the Vril Society is not completely bizarre. It's conceivable, but it strained credulity for me somewhat that in 2016, some guy is calling me or writing me and saying this. Anyway, I dismissed the guy. He sounded like a nutcase, and I had come out with this book, which, although it's a very serious philosophical text, Prometheus and Atlas, goes into all kinds of paranormal phenomena, and in the last chapter also engages with UFO phenomenon, and I had been getting kind of crank emails from a lot of people. So I dismissed the guy. Then I got involved at the same time with a very high-level Iranian opposition group. So I'm Persian by paternal descent. And for a long time, since at least I would say, at least in a serious way, since 2009, when there was that green uprising in Iran. At least since 2009, I had been involved in a serious way in the Iranian opposition to the Islamic Republic to try to, remove this regime from
The
power.
green is cancer,
and
guys.
To develop a form of government to reflect the will of the Iranian people. So I get involved with this very high-level socio-political group devoted to a cultural and political revolution in Iran, not just regime change, but a cultural revolution in Iran. And then once I'm involved with them, this guy contacts me again. And he says to me, we have a broadcast facility in Croatia where we can bombard the Islamic Republic with whatever anti-regime propaganda you want to tailor for this purpose. And there's a guy in Washington, Michael Bagley, who runs a private intelligence agency called Jellyfish. And they're the ones managing this dish in Croatia, which can bombard, the Islamic Republic with whatever kind of message you want to get into the country. And I said, all right, look, let me just Google this character, right? And I Googled him, and there was a story from Mother Jones and a story that had been run in Wired about Jellyfish, which was presenting the organization as the Salvaged Intelligence Directorate of Blackwater. You remember what Blackwater was? Of course. Eric Prince, right?
Yep.
Okay, so what happened was Blackwater fell apart, and Eric Prince he became increasingly dissatisfied with the kinds of people that were around him and the kinds of people that he had to deal with within the U.S. deep state and the intelligence community. I think he came to feel that his efforts to bring security to Iraq were being undermined by people in the broader intelligence community. And so he sort of left what had been Blackwater, and the organization disintegrated. That was, of course, a mercenary organization, right, but it had an in-house intelligence service. And Jellyfish was a rebranded form of Blackwater's intelligence service. It's in-house intelligence.
Oh, fuck, what you are talking about, bro? What the fuck?
As Eric Prince's, intelligence director, this guy, Michael Bagley.
Okay.
So this creepy, crazy guy in London tells me, call Michael Bagley, and he will be able to help you with these regime change efforts in Iran. So I said, fine, with one phone call, I'll figure out whether this guy's a crank or whether there's something to this. And I called, and the guy was expecting my call. We had a nice conversation.
Bagley was?
Yeah. And we had a couple meetings over the course of a few months. We had a lot of correspondence and a couple of meetings in person. And so basically, this guy in London, Jonathan, got me involved with the former intelligence directorate of Blackwater through my interest in bringing about regime change in Iran, because he failed with this whole bizarre Vril society angle, right?
Right.
But then over the course of my much more tangible involvement with Michael and Jellyfish in terms of Iran regime change, he brought this weird stuff back into the conversation.
The Nazi stuff.
Weird stuff related to that. Like, for example, we had been discussing this privately, my interaction with Jacques Vallée. So at one point, Jonathan tells me that, and by the way, let me just preface this. This is kind of out of the order of the story, but it's worth mentioning up front so that people get more of a sense of who it was I was dealing with. When this whole fiasco wound up ending with my defamation in the pages of the New York Times and Newsweek and stories on NBC and so forth, I dug into who this character was, this Londoner.
Jonathan.
Yeah. And this guy has been initiated into more than a handful of the top secret societies in the world. He was like a 32nd or 33rd degree Mason. He belonged to all kinds of, like Rosicrucian, Golden Dawn orders, and all over the world, from Argentina to various countries in Europe.
What?
Also, look, I was working to try to bring about regime change in Iran, right?
Right.
So I had a little bit of involvement with people in Mossad as well. And
oh, really?
Yeah. And for the record, I've never taken a single shekel from the state of Israel. By the way, they offered me money, and I was so insulted that at that point I cut off communication with them. But in any case, I did work closely with about 4 different people in Mossad.
How did you get connected with them?
it was part of the, let's say, lobbying efforts we were carrying out for the sake of change of regime in Iran during the Trump administration, which, if you can remember, at that time, he had, well, Mike Pence had, since 2009 in the Congress, Mike Pence had been a very outspoken advocate for regime change in Iran. And then at that time, John Bolton was also, if you remember, in the administration, and he's been an Iran regime change hawk. So anyway, we were carrying out some serious lobbying in Washington. I went to the Capitol and had some meetings, including with one of the members of the National Security Council at one point. And anyway, in that context, as you can imagine, I also engage with people representing the state of Israel, because there's no country in the world that has more of a vested interest in seeing the regime change in Iran than Israel does, for very good reason. But my point is this: one of these characters in Mossad had worked with Jonathan before and knew him quite well. And in the course of conversation, he inadvertently revealed to me that Jonathan was a well-placed MI6 operative, which I had not been aware of. I thought he's just like some Britisher who knows the head of Blackwater intelligence. But then I find out, and I found this out very late in my involvement with him, and had I known this up front, I would not have been dealing with him. But anyway, point being, so Guy's initiated into all these secret societies. He's also an MI6 operative, okay? And he's doing things like writing letters saying he's the head of the British branch of the Vril Society. Okay, so this guy at one point, he introduces me to a former NASA JPL engineer who has supposedly schematics for a retrofitted, reverse-engineered version of the Nazi bell. Okay, there was this thing called Die Glocke.
Danny, I use the same trimmer for everything, and now my face smells like balls. Sounds like you need the BBB, brother. The big black. It's the beard and balls bundle from Manscaped. Or 5.8.
If we want to, once we get into the disclosure conversation, David Grush has talked about how there was this crash in 1933 in Magenta, Italy.
Right.
And Mussolini brought the Germans in right away. Okay, so this explains why this guy Beluzzo was involved on the engineering team, and why they put the project not in Germany but in a third-party country, namely, Czechoslovakia.
Okay.
Right. So because it was a joint Italian-German operation, they picked a third country to do it in, and they had this think tank, and they built something which basically was a power plant shaped like an acorn or a bell. Okay. And inside this thing were two counter-rotating cylinders, one filled with mercury and one filled with thorium, which are both radioactive isotopes. Mm-hmm. And apparently, when this contraption, which is spinning the mercury and thorium in opposite directions at a very high velocity, when this is pulsed the right way with a combination of AC and DC power, it causes the plasma to undergo a state change. It causes the mercury and thorium isotopes to undergo a state change and to interact with each other in a way that opens up a controlled vortex. So just the way that, like, you can take, uranium or plutonium, right? And under the very carefully calibrated, extremely precise explosive force, you can get that material, the yellow cake, uranium, to enter into a state of fusion, nuclear fusion. The mercury and the thorium isotopes inside this Bell device will undergo a state change, which then puts out more energy than you're putting into the system.
Okay.
Right? So, like, with nuclear technology, you can either create an uncontrolled fission reaction, or you can control the nuclear reaction to have a power plant that you get, like, calibrated energy from out of. Mm-hmm. And this Bell was like that. It was something that could generate power and be a source basically of free energy, in the sense that you're getting more energy out of it than you're putting into it.
Okay, real quick. What year is this again?
43 to 44.
No. What year is this when the MI6 guy, or the guy from Jellyfish, introduced you to the guy from JPL?
It was spring of 2017, if I'm not mistaken.
The spring of 2017.
Yeah.
So, and who was the one who introduced you to the JPL guy? Was it the jellyfish guy or was it
No, it was the guy in London.
MI6 guy?
Yeah, MI6 guy.
So why is this MI6 operative introducing somebody who's trying to lobby for an Iranian regime change to somebody working on some ancient Nazi science?
Remember, the guy introduced himself to me as the head of the British branch of the Vril Society, and I completely dismissed him. So what I think is that when he saw me, clearly I was under surveillance by these people. And when he saw me involved with Iran regime change and saw that I was willing to basically risk my life for the sake of that project, which I was, by the way, and we can get into that too, you know, the crazy lengths I went to try to facilitate regime change in Iran. He saw that it's something that I cared about so much that he could use it to manipulate me. So it wasn't about the Iran stuff. That was just a way, I think, to get a hook into me to try to engage him on other things, which had more to do with UFOs and parapsychology and
That's
so on
what
and
you,
so forth.
okay.
That's my guess of what his MO was. So he introduces me to this JPL guy who's got these schematics that claim to be an updating of this Bell technology to our time, right? So you imagine 1940s, we had computers the size of walls, right? Giant transistors. If you're going to build something like the Bell today, it doesn't need to be that size, whatever that thing was, 9 to 12 feet tall. You could probably put it, as they claimed, in a cylinder like this size. And this guy had these schematics of basically this mercury thorium reactor, which was in this kind of cylindrical form. And they had clusters of them that were connected to each other that would collectively produce power. And each of them would fit inside an encased module, and you could put these modules together. Like each one was like a slice in a pizza pie, and you could build this larger power plant. And the idea with that is that you could scale it up as much as you wanted. You could use this thing to power a car, or you could use it to power an aircraft carrier, and depending on how many modules you connected to each other. And he sends me. Okay, so I had dinner with Jacques Vallée at his home. When was it? And I think it was late 2016 or very early 2017. And it was about my book Prometheus and Atlas, because he had read Prometheus and Atlas shortly after it came out. And of course, I discuss his work in that book, you know, his Passport to Magonia, Invisible College were significant influences on my philosophical analysis of the UFO phenomenon. And it was reflected in the text of Prometheus and Atlas. And I think also that there were some novel ideas I had in that book about the archetype of Prometheus and how it expresses the essence of technological science as a force in world history, and how I developed that idea in the context of the philosophical work of, say, Martin Heidegger, which Jacques was very interested in. And so he invited me to his home. We had a very nice dinner together. And there was one picture of us that I suppose, made the mistake of posting in social media. And this guy, Jonathan, saw that photo. So he became aware of the fact that I was involved with Jacques Vallée and had some kind of access to him. So then, I guess late spring 2017 or early summer, he sends me with this NASA JPL guy to Jacques in San Francisco. And I set up a meeting in the Fairmont Hotel, actually, on top of Nob Hill.
Mm-hmm.
And this guy presents these schematics to Vallée. And he does this in the guise of Vallée as a Silicon Valley venture capitalist, saying to him, basically, look, we have this blueprint, I guess you call it, blueprint. Mm-hmm. And we're working on a prototype, and we want to try to find venture capital for this. And long story short, I was supposed to meet with Jacques again to get his personal assessment of what this guy was about, because frankly, at this point, I didn't trust any of these people. Right. And I was starting to think that maybe I am being played by some kind of, master manipulators of the type that Vallée discusses at length in his book, Messengers of Deception. He wrote this whole book in the late 70s about intelligence agencies and basically criminal syndicates who use the UFO phenomenon and other bizarre happenings in order to manipulate people through a kind of elaborate smoke and mirrors game. And I actually wanted his opinion on whether he thought that these were the kinds of people that I was dealing with, in which case I was really thinking at that point to cut them off. But anyway, he had some kind of personal surgery and personal issues that prevented me from regrouping with him after this meeting with the NASA engineer, the former NASA JPL engineer.
Right.
So I never got to get his assessment. And then I think it was within a month later that I was defamed in the New York Times. And frankly, I don't blame Valet for not wanting to communicate with me after that. He has a very significant reputation to maintain. And here I am being accused of all kinds of nonsense.
So how did you get defamed? How did that happen?
Okay, so I'll lead with that, and then I'll wrap back around to tell you another relevant story with regard to this Londoner.
Okay.
In, I think it was June of 2017, I sat down with this young man in a bar in the shadow of the Empire State Building, who purported to be a right-wing youth from Sweden who had been on assignment in Britain, studying like Viking pagan groups for some thesis he was writing about freedom of the suppression of freedom of expression in academia. So he claimed to be writing this thesis about how free speech is being suppressed in academia.
Okay.
And that his main subject of research were right-wing groups in Europe. And he had been in Britain, and these guys at the London Forum had basically written to me and begged me to meet with this guy when he visited New York. Now, the London Forum is a kind of right-leaning think tank in London, where I had been invited in February of 2017 to come give a talk on Heidegger and philosophy of technology, right, and to promote my book, Prometheus and Atlas. Now, I guess who set up that talk for me at the London Forum in February of 2017?
Not Jonathan.
Yes, Jonathan. Yes. And interestingly enough, when I went to speak at the London Forum, by the way, there were police helicopters around the building. There was a police cordon around the building. We're talking about Britain earlier off record, right? I mean, I have never seen a police presence like this in my life. For some 25, 30 right-wing people collected into a room presenting intellectual papers, there was such an Antifa presence marshaled outside this conference hotel that they cordoned the whole place off, not just with cops on the ground, but with police helicopters. There were literally chopper noises in the background of my talk on Heidegger's philosophy of technology. So, but here's the thing. Jonathan, who invited me to this talk, never showed. He didn't come to the conference himself. And anyway, I'm not going to go into the details there, but point being, it was very suspicious. And then it's these London Forum guys who contact me and they say, look, this young kid's coming and he's doing this dissertation thing. And, you know, we want you to help him out. He wants to interview you and get your perspective on this subject, suppression of freedom of speech in academia. So I sit down with this guy in this pub, and little do I know, he's wired under his clothes. Okay? He's wired with a camera and microphone under his clothes.
Is this it?
Yeah. And so he films 2 hours of footage of me. 2 hours. And of this 2 hours of footage, 2 minutes of it wind up in the New York Times. Right? So imagine that. The guy records me for 2 hours, and the 2 hours of audio is spliced down to 2 minutes with sentences and half sentences of mine stitched together to make it sound like I said things that I didn't.
What did they try to make you say?
So I'll give you an example. At one point, I talk about how I think that if the current migration policies continue, remember, this was 2017. So starting in 2014, 2015, we had seen Angela Merkel in Germany allowing these millions of migrants to come in through Turkey from Syria, right, and so forth.
Yeah.
Europe was being overrun by migrants, both from the Middle East and from North Africa.
Okay.
And there were women in all across Germany. There were horrendous social problems that were ensuing as a result of this.
Okay.
And so I said in that interview, look, if these policies continue like this, we're going to see a horrendous backlash, a right-wing reaction, And by 2050, you're going to have Alexander, Napoleon, and Hitler on European currency, which is a rather melodramatic, statement, right? But it's making a point that if this kind of policy continues for another 20, 30 years, there's going to be a very extreme right-wing reaction.
Yeah.
So at one point I say that. At another completely different juncture in the conversation, we're discussing a potential nuclear war between India and Pakistan. And I say to him in that context that we, meaning the West allied with India, could win that war at the cost of a few 100 million people. Now you have to understand, India is a country with a population of what, like 1.2 billion, something like that.
Right.
Pakistan's got like, I don't know, a couple 100 million people, right? So I'm talking about a potential nuclear war in the Indian subcontinent might be won by India at the cost of a few 100 million people. So he takes that passage at the cost of a few 100 million people and the Alexander, Napoleon, Hitler thing, and splices them together like I'm advocating for the return of Nazism and calling for the extermination of hundreds of millions of people, like in Europe and the West. To give you one example of the horrendous distortions. So predictions were turned into prescriptions, and completely unrelated statements were stitched to one another, and 2 hours of audio cut down to about 2.5 minutes and put right there in the New York Times, and then carried by Newsweek and a lot of other mainstream media.
And what was the purpose of this? What axe did they have to grind? What did they gain by doing this to you?
So I had been involved, not involved, I was a formative member of what we called the Alt-Right Corporation. In 2016, the alt-right, as Trump was running for office, right? Mm-hmm. The alt-right was this completely amorphous shit show of various political tendencies, from libertarians to fascists, frankly, to, Christian evangelical type groups. There was no cohesive and coherent overarching ideology. The only thing that bound the so-called alternative right together was its opposition to basically, typical entrenched conservatism, right? Like the Republican Party in the United States. Big business, typical conservatism. The only thing that bound all these groups together was that. And the way I got involved with this is that basically I had been looking at this political landscape and forecasting that we were going to have the rise of a very regressive, traditionalist, white identity politics. And I wanted to try to make sure that the alt-right did not go in that direction. At the same time, I was working, as I said, with the Iranian opposition. And this is going to be a difficult one for you to wrap your mind around, and maybe also some of your listeners, because people are very unfamiliar with the sociopolitics of Iran. But Iran means Aryan. And so Iran is, like, definitionally speaking, the Aryan nation. The name of the country means that. It's the cradle and homeland of the Aryans. And so the discourse that's rising up today against Islamic fundamentalism in Iran is an Aryan discourse. It's a discourse for the revival of the pre-Islamic identity of the Persian people and of other Iranians. But what Aryan means in Iran is completely different from what it meant in, 1940s Europe or 1930s Europe, right? So
what did it mean?
Well, the term technically just means noble. Noble. And it's a self-descriptor that the people in that land applied to themselves, right? So
land of the Aryans.
Yeah, land of the Aryans. So look, here's the thing. Iran, traditionally throughout history, has been the most cosmopolitan country on earth. It's a civilization that emerged from out of the synthesis of all kinds of different people, some of them ethnically related, like the Persians and the Scythians and the Medes, who are all Aryans or Iranians, but many others, not ethnically related, like the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Lydians. Iran, at its very foundation, was a very sort of multi-ethnic cosmopolitan entity. And it became even more so throughout the course of history, because if you look at where Iran is placed geographically, it's right at the crossroads of the world. It's between India, China, Eurasia,
Right.
and the Middle East and North Africa. So it is the crossroads of the world. And throughout the course of history, it served as the single greatest conduit for the cross-pollination of various civilizations, right? It's how Europe influenced India and how Indian influences streamed back into Europe. It had a fundamental impact on Chinese civilization. And then when the Mongols came in and conquered Iran, Asian civilization also impacted Iranian identity. So it's like this global melting pot. It's the closest thing to a civilizational melting pot that you had before the United States arose. And there are a lot of structural similarities. Actually, Jefferson was deeply influenced by ancient Iranian political thought when he came up with the Constitution of the United States, because he was reading Greeks like Xenophon and Herodotus,
Right.
who wrote about the structure of the Persian imperial system.
Amin was telling me about this.
Yeah, which was a federal system. Anyway, and they all had tremendous reverence for Cyrus, the founder of the Persian Empire, the father of Iran, as this great humanitarian, cosmopolitan, humanistic statesman, right? So I have this whole Persian heritage, and I'm involved in this Iranian opposition movement, which is reclaiming Aryan identity, but in this cosmopolitan sense.
Right.
And so I have this vision that if I can take what was then called the European New Right, Nouvelle Droite in Europe, and my books, are published by the leading press, Arctos, the leading press of the European New Right, which, by the way, also publishes Alexander Dugin. And I thought to myself, if I can take the European New Right and this shit show that's the emerging American alt-right, and I can fuse it somehow with the Aryan Renaissance in Iran, then I can shift the trajectory of this whole thing away from white nationalism and this kind of regressive, traditionalist white identity politics towards something much more progressive and cosmopolitan.
Right.
Okay? This is what I'm thinking.
So when I think of alt-right, how it's portrayed in the media and how it's been portrayed in the media during Trump's whole campaign and his whole run, it was mainly like an opposition against Trump, right? It was a term that was, I don't know if it was hijacked or...
You mean a way to damage Trump?
A way to... When you think of alt-right, you're thinking of like extreme right-wing, white nationalist, racist people, right?
Yeah.
So what is the actual how do you define alt-right?
Well, when I got involved with the thing, the term had been defined by Paul Gottfried, who was a Jew and a libertarian.
Okay.
So it had no definition. If we rewind the clock back to October of 2016, it was an amorphous phenomenon. There were these white nationalists involved.
Right.
And I was concerned, looking at what was happening in Europe with the migrants, right, that this nascent alt-right in America would fuse with the worst elements in Europe, and that we would see a kind of return to fascism.
Okay.
And so what I wanted to do was to recalibrate the trajectory. Now, this Londoner exploited that interest of mine and got himself involved with my attempts to create alliances between Americans, Europeans, and Persians during that period of time. And he actually made the promise to me that his associates would bankroll the formation of a single corporation, the alt-right corporation, to fuse a number of different entities. My publisher, Arctos Media, this media outfit called Red Ice Radio and Television, and also a think tank called the National Policy Institute, which at that time Richard Spencer had been running. And they told me, look, Giorgiani, you be the chairman of this thing, and we're going to make you a liaison to the White House, where you'll go in and engage with Steve Bannon and try to influence Trump's policies through engagement with Bannon. And Bannon was known to have been an avid reader of the books put out by my publisher. He's interested in Dugin. He sat down with Dugin at one point. And he's interested in Evola, Julius Evola, and other authors that are published by my publishing house. So the idea was to turn me into a person who could basically consolidate the European New Right and the alt-right and be a liaison to the White House. And the way they hooked me was to tell me that this would facilitate our efforts at regime change in Iran. That was the main, I think, angle of approach that they used to convince me to do this. But here's the thing. Between January of 2017, when that corporation was formed, and September of 2017, when I was defamed, that funding that was promised never materialized. And they gave me excuse after excuse after I mean Jonathan's people, gave me excuse after excuse, and Jellyfish, why the funding wasn't coming through. They gave me every excuse. And at some point, I think it was in the spring, I would say, of 2017, I had it with them, and I was ready to cut off these people and say, okay, well, clearly they've been playing me this whole time. And then here's what they do in response to that. Jonathan sends me a nearly $1 billion oil contract. The actual sum was 800 something, close to $900 million for the reconstruction of the Venezuelan national oil industry. So now if you rewind back to spring of...
What do you mean he sent you a contract?
It was, it was like maybe 100 pages, nearly 100 pages. And the contract outlined the reconstruction of every aspect of Venezuela's national oil industry. So if you rewind back to May of 2017, nothing was going on in Venezuela. About 4 or 5 months later, there started to be major protests against the government there. And what he had told me when he sent me this contract was that we are going to overthrow the government of Venezuela, and we need
the UK is?
I don't know on behalf of what entity he was speaking. Look, I found out the guy was an MI6 operative. But, I mean, we can discuss this also later in the course of our conversation. The intelligence services of countries are routinely infiltrated. And I think that there are many rogue elements and outfits inside certainly our intelligence services in the United States, and I'm sure also in theirs, right? So I don't know who this we was exactly, right? But clearly, they were controlling the former intelligence directorate of Blackwater, and they had deep ties in MI6. And he said, look, we're going to overthrow the government of Venezuela, and we need to get into the oil industry before we do that. Now, here's the interesting thing. 4 or 5 months later, I forget exactly, within 6 months of that time, there was this massive revolt against Maduro in Venezuela.
Yes.
And the way Maduro put that down is he rounded up the oil bosses. So he knew the coup was coming from within the oil industry. Okay, so this lines up with what the guy told me. But why am I telling you this? My point is this, that people might look at this and say, like, Giorgiani, how were you so naive to be strung along for so long by these people? Well, look, when someone puts a $900 million oil contract in front of you, and, they seem to be capable of reconstructing the Venezuelan national oil industry. And by the way, I was also told that they were behind. This came out in the course.
Wait, I don't understand. Why did they put it in front of you? What was the purpose of putting it in front of you? He just wanted to show you, like showing off?
No. I knew a petroleum engineer at one of the most prominent oil companies in the world. And he said to me, because here's the thing, remember, they had promised me this money for the Alt-Right Corporation, capital investment to make me chairman of the Alt-Right Corporation. Money never came through. So now he's saying, look, we'll get you the money by some other means.
Here's proof of funds or something?
Well, we'll raise the funds. So he said, take this contract to this oil executive that you know, and if his company is willing to carry out this project, you'll get the commission on the deal.
Okay, I see.
You'll get the commission. And by the way, this petroleum engineer said to me, I think probably wisely on his part, he said, look, I don't want any part of this money. If I get a commission from this deal, you can have all of it. Now, that would be a lot more than what they had initially been promising me as a capital investment to set up the Alt-Right Corporation and preside over it as its chairman. So point being, these people gave me reason not to dismiss them and disconnect with them. And that's how they strung me along for as long as they did. Interestingly enough, my defamation came, I think, within less than a month of my resigning from the Alt-Right Corporation. Within 24 hours of Charlottesville. So the situation, the situation was my partners. Look, here's the thing. I was supposed to be the chairman, right? But I was also supposed to bring in this money for the corporation. Since I didn't bring in the money, I began to be sidelined by my partners. And by about, the summer of 2017, I had completely lost control of this entity. It had become like a Frankenstein's monster, right? I lost control of it. And my partners went to Charlottesville and made this mess. And within 24 hours, I said, no. I was still involved at a high level in Iranian opposition lobbying in Washington and so forth. So I said, no, there's no way I want to be involved with this. I mean, this has become a travesty. and I resigned. Now, I hardly think it's a coincidence that it's only several weeks after my resignation that I was defamed in the New York Times, and that they used a video that they had recorded months prior to that. So let me go back to the bar in the shadow of the Empire State Building, where this young man recorded me.
Yes.
I did my digging after that, and I found out that this organization that he claimed to represent, Hope Not Hate, some social justice, SJW, Antifa type organization, is actually a front for British intelligence. It was a front for MI5 domestically, initially in Britain, and I think it's opened a branch in the United States, so at this point probably it's under the jurisdiction of MI6. So point being, that kid was at the very least operating at the behest of people involved with British intelligence. And when did they choose to release this video in the New York Times? After they've lost me as an asset, once I have resigned from the alt-right corporation.
So, from what I'm understanding, whoever is behind this guy, Jonathan, at the MI6, they do not want you to create some sort of an alliance between the United States right wing, Europe, and Iran.
Yes.
Why? What is their motivation for wanting to throw a wrench in that plan?
Twofold, at least. One, on the ideological level, such a constellation of power would prevent the right wing in the West, let's say in general, from going in a racist, fascist direction.
Yes.
That mirrors what happened in 1930s, 40s Europe. Why? Because the Iranian youth are not interested in some Nazi-style regime to replace the Islamic Republic.
Right.
They're interested in women's equal rights, freedom of expression, and technological and scientific progress. You probably aren't aware of this. Maybe a lot of your audience isn't either. Iran is one of those few countries that enjoys the distinction of having been the world leader in science and technology for 250 years, no less. Between about, let's say, 900 AD and 1150 AD, while Europe was in the dark age of medievalism,
right.
Iran was a powerhouse of scientific research and technological innovation. So, the Persians are one of these people who have contributed tremendously to the advancement of knowledge and to, creative innovation on the planet. And it goes back to the basic ethos of Zoroastrianism and Mithraism, which I don't know if we get a chance we'll get into. But, the whole teaching of Zarathustra is oriented around the progressive spirit at work in the cosmos and what it means to be a co-creator with the divine and to build a more ideal future for everybody, right? It's a very futuristic, progressive mindset. And this is what is now overthrowing the Islamic Republic, not just on a political level, but in terms of cultural revolution. And my thinking had been that if I could plug European and American society into the battery that is the Iranian youth, then I could redirect this right-wing reaction in a way that would be much more futurist, progressive, and humanitarian.
Got it.
You see?
Got it.
And clearly somebody in British intelligence doesn't want that to be the case. Now, there's another more tangible, let's say, materialistic concern.
Why don't you think they want that to be the case?
You remember how I was telling you that in the years leading up to the Blitz, in the years leading up to the bombing of London by the Nazis and so on and so forth, Hitler actually tried to make peace with some well-placed aristocrats in Britain, and they had, I think it was something like a third of the House of Lords or so forth that were sympathetic to them. Clearly, there's some kind of an elite element in Britain that is aligned with this, I don't know whether you want to call it national socialist or fascist agenda. And who knows if, they control the British state, but they may be a rogue element that has a certain agenda that they want to see unfold in the world. And that agenda may include, the rise of a very, racist and hierarchical form of political power in the European continent. and in the West at large. But I think that there's another aspect of this that's much more cynical and down to earth. And that's that I didn't want Iran to be looted. When I was involved in the opposition, it became very clear to me that, Iran is encircled by corporate vultures who are just waiting for this regime to collapse so that they can come in and colonize the country. Iran never was properly colonized, but it came awfully close when the British and the Russians carved up the country into spheres of influence in the early 1900s and basically controlled all of Iran's resources. Remember, the British came in the early 20th century and they created something called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which later became British Petroleum. It became British Petroleum after Mohammad Mossadegh kicked their asses out of Iran. Right? Mohammad Mossadegh, the democratically elected nationalist prime minister of Iran, nationalized Iran's oil in 1951. And this was a huge blow to the British in particular. And that's when the Anglo-Persian Oil Company became what we know as British Petroleum today, right? So there's a whole history of the exploitation of Iran's resources by foreign powers. And the agenda that my colleagues and I were pursuing for regime change in Iran was one that would protect Iran's national resources from this kind of foreign exploitation. And I also think that they did not want someone, who looks the way I do and who speaks English as fluently as I do as a native New Yorker and an American to be able to be an international mouthpiece for the defense of Iran's national interests once the Islamic Republic were to be overthrown. So that's a much more cynical agenda that I think was also at play.
It's also crazy that they were able to get the New York Times. Did the New York Times reach out to you before they published this?
I think maybe 18 hours beforehand.
18 hours beforehand.
Yeah, you can imagine that day for me. I threatened to sue the guy. I was ranting at him on the telephone.
The editor of the show.
Yeah, I was like, are you kidding me? This was a 2-hour conversation. Like, what? If you print, anyway. Yeah, I was not happy, to say the least. I got about 18 hours heads up from this guy.
Yeah, it's interesting that they would publish something like that so quickly.
Yeah, well, you know this, Danny.
With one source.
The New York Times, Newsweek, NBC, CBS, they all have intelligence operatives well placed within their organizations. They are controlled their narrative is controlled by the Anglo-American deep state. And so that suggests to me that one piece of evidence right there, that one data point suggests to me that actually whoever was pulling the strings in London is part of the Anglo-American establishment because they have that kind of reach with the New York Times.
I've had people on here that have worked with big publications like similar to the New York Times, some of them actually with the New York Times. And they've explained their experience with reporting on topics such as like covert ops, for example, that the CIA deputy director has a relationship with the editor-in-chief of some of these publications, right? And they have to, when it comes to reporting on some of these things that involve the CIA, they have to run it by the deputy director or whoever it is that's their liaison at that publication. And typically, they won't just say, no, don't run this. This is false, or we're denying this, so you cannot run this. You're not allowed to run this. They'll say, we're not going to tell you whether this is true or false, but if you do run this, you could be responsible for tons of innocent lives or operatives that we have embedded in these places that are going to die. So blood's on your hands.
And they also say to them, if you don't run this, there are 5 or 6 other interesting stories that we can help you tell, by dealing you certain sensitive information. They make these kinds of deals with them as well. One of the publications that I went to after my defamation, I didn't go to them, but I was approached by them. And I thought I would use it as an opportunity to basically clear my name and tell my side of the story, because supposedly this publication had a history of speaking truth to power, and, basically exposing corrupt machinations in the context of foreign wars in Iraq and so forth. And that was The Intercept. The Intercept came to me. Yeah, they did a piece on me. The Intercept came to me, and I'm thinking, okay, well, it's not the New York Times, right? I mean, they have a history of opposing the deep state, so I thought, right? And
this is the publication that Glenn Greenwald used?
Exactly.
Okay,
So here's where I'm going with this, is that Glenn Greenwald later came out and basically exposed the fact that he himself couldn't function at The Intercept, which he co-founded,
Right.
because the thing had been infiltrated by intelligence people and deep state operatives.
Right.
Well, that makes sense out of the story they eventually told about me, because I went to them with the kind of information that I'm sharing with you, and I shared documents with them. I gave them letters that I had exchanged with, let's just say, various intelligence people in the course of all these dealings. And so I was giving them documentation of what had happened with me.
Mm-hmm.
And I was expecting a story about, some kind of international intelligence operation and, a philosopher and activist who had gotten caught up in it and was ultimately targeted by it. Instead, they published a personal hit piece on me with none of that information in it. One small paragraph saying, Giorgiani claims X, Y, and Z, but we haven't been able to corroborate whatever. And the rest of it was basically mud smearing yellow journalism from The Intercept. Not long before Glenn Greenwald left in protest himself.
Wow. So you got a target on your back.
Yeah, absolutely.
Intelligence has a big target on you.
Absolutely.
That's unsettling. What is that like? How do you live with that?
You have to ignore it to the greatest extent possible, and just stay focused on positive goals, right? So for example, after the involvement with the alt-right, after my activism with the Iranian Renaissance, which extended up to 2019, and by the way, we were planning a coup within the Islamic Republic, and it's when that didn't pan out that I resigned, because there were certain of us.
How did you plan a coup?
Yeah, so here's the interesting thing. There was this president of Iran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who became infamous in the global media for being a Holocaust denier. And he came and gave a number of controversial speeches here, not just at the UN in his capacity as president, but also at Columbia University. And he was kind of a cartoon character, supposedly very vehemently anti-Israel and a representative of uneducated underclass people in Iran, right? And I had actually protested against him back in 2009, 2010, when he was president. I became a human rights activist and a solidarity protest organizer who was tasked with lobbying the Security Council members of the UN to place sanctions on the regime in Tehran after this Ahmadinejad was fraudulently reelected. So I was directly organizing protests against Ahmadinejad back in 2009, which made it all the more ironic that in 2017, 2018, when I was involved with these Iranian opposition people, we found out that actually Mahmoud Ahmadinejad had this guru, Rahim Esfandiar Mashai, who was nominally his vice president, but actually his guru, his spiritual guru. And this Esfandiar Mashai had a very eclectic spiritual worldview, which was well outside the parameters of Orthodox Shiite Islam. And he believed in some kind of a Neo-Zoroastrian revival, a revival of ancient Persian mysticism and a fusion of Iran's Aryan identity with Shiaism. And this Mashai wanted to transition Iran out of an Islamic system and toward a nationalist one, toward a more populist system that would be more in line with the will of the Iranian people and their wish to reclaim their historical identity. And most interestingly, despite Ahmadinejad being branded as a Holocaust denier in the mainstream media, it turned out that Mashai was actually in favor of a secret détente with the state of Israel. So this became one of the reasons for my involvement with a couple of the Mossad characters that I engaged with, because the Israelis, the Israelis have been talking about bombing Iran for 2 decades. And at that time in particular, there had been these very violent, vigorous protests against the regime, to the point where a lot of Iranians were even actually setting mosques on fire and burning Qurans in the street and so forth.
Wow.
Yeah, it's very burning Qurans is very popular in Iran today. It's very popular. So, but they were burning mosques in these protests in 2017, 2018. And the Israelis wanted to use this as a moment of opportunity to potentially come and bomb the nuclear sites and facilitate a regime change. And at least back then, I was very opposed to that. I was opposed to any form of foreign military intervention in Iran. Mm-hmm. I wanted to see the regime change at the hands of the Iranian people themselves. We wanted support. It could be some material support, definitely moral support, but I wasn't for military intervention. So I'm hearing from inside this circle in Iran, the circle of Ahmadinejad and Mashai, that not only do they want to gradually transition out of the Islamic Republic and toward a more nationalist, more Iranian style of government, mm-hmm. they're also open to a secret détente with Israel, like a under the table alliance with Israel, where they basically share power in the Middle East. And I conveyed this to the Israelis. Basically, I took it upon myself to go to the Israelis and be like,
that they wanted this.
Yeah, listen, we understand. Look, if there's a coup in Iran, if you see a coup all of a sudden in Iran and Mahmoud Ahmadinejad winds up the new leader of the country, not just president, but because in the Iranian constitution, the president has no power. It's a dictatorship where the supreme leader does everything, and the president is just basically like a diversionary, front man.
Okay.
And there was this coup plan to actually put Ahmadinejad and certain other people in power. And my job was to convey to the Israelis that, look, he may sound like whatever you think, Holocaust denier or whatever, but there is a secret agenda to make a détente with Israel. And this is going to work out to your benefit. So just sit tight, right?
What did they say?
They were very open to that. There was a faction around Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman, who are they're quite orthodox. And because they're quite orthodox, they put a lot of stock in this idea of Cyrus the Great as the Messiah of the Jews. In the Old Testament, particularly in the book of Isaiah, the only non-Jew, the only Goyim, who is ever identified as a Moshiach, or savior brought by God, is Cyrus the Great, the father of Iran. Whose tomb is a pilgrimage site today for many Iranian youth. It's like the most sacred. Iranians have turned their backs on Mecca and they bow toward the tomb of Cyrus the Great instead. So they were very sympathetic to Iran as a land that is connected with their own spiritual destiny. And they also were, I found, rather shrewd and pragmatic in terms of working out an under-the-table understanding with the Islamic Republic. And I sent a letter to Defense Minister Lieberman, which was conveyed by apparent agents of Mossad. And the way that I know that this letter reached him, letter where I was saying basically, please don't bomb Iran. Yeah. And look, if you see a coup, understand that even though it may have a nominally Aryan discourse, mm-hmm. that means something completely different in the context of our civilization, as you well know, since the father of our culture is Cyrus the Great, your Moshiach, so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. And the way I know this letter reached Defense Minister Lieberman is that at a certain point, Netanyahu kicked Lieberman out of the government, and he took over the position of defense minister in addition to being prime minister, which is very unusual. There was a time when he was acting both as prime minister and he took over Lieberman's duties as defense minister. And at that point, they contacted me from Tel Aviv and said, you need to rewrite your letter and address it to Prime Minister Netanyahu directly. So it appears to have reached him. Anyway, why did I tell this story?
So did you do that?
No comment. I wish him luck in Gaza. And I wish him luck in Lebanon. So why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because you asked coup in Iran, right? So we had this plan where they came and they told us that about 1/3, believe it or not, of the armed forces of Iran, including the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, who are supposed to be like the Praetorian Guard, most loyal to the regime, 1/3 of the armed forces in Iran were supposedly ready to turn And this didn't mean that 2/3 were for the regime. A lot of them were undecided and in disarray. And there was this faction around Esfandiar Mashai and Ahmadinejad who had the underclass, who had like basically, workers and people on welfare and so on and so forth. And the reason they reached out to us is that they said that the people in our circle could represent the intellectual elite, basically the intelligentsia of Iranian society, and that they needed such people in a coalition if they were to be successful, because the intelligentsia would not follow Ahmadinejad and Mashai. And so my associates were made this proposal, and they decided not to take it. They decided not to accept this offer. And I became very frustrated by that. And that's why I ultimately resigned from that organization, the Iranian Renaissance, because frankly, even as a native-born American and native New Yorker, I was ready to get on a plane and go to Tehran and potentially face execution to be part of this coup attempt. They were not, because they had cushy jobs in various industries like the oil industry and so forth. And I think ultimately their lives were just too comfortable to risk something like that. And in the end, they went in with people who were more connected to, let's say, intelligence services here and lobbyists in Washington and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that was another question I had. What was America's position on this coup?
We found Vice President Pence to be very sympathetic. The problem with Trump was that John Bolton was his national security advisor. And John Bolton is connected to, believe it or not, I know this sounds crazy, an Islamist Marxist terrorist group that's been fighting a civil war against the Islamic Republic since the 1980s. So there were these people in the early 1980s who had been part of the revolutionary coalition that overthrew the Shah.
Right.
They were the muscle behind the Islamic Revolution, but they were more Marxist Maoist types.
Okay.
That tried to fuse like a Che Guevara style leftism with Islam. And in 1983 or so, in the middle of the Iran-Iraq war, they defected to the side of Saddam Hussein. And they formed what is essentially a terroristic cult with like a North Korea style, cult of personality and closed atmosphere in Iraq. And later they were kicked out of Iraq and they wound up rebasing themselves in Albania, of all places. Anyway, John Bolton was in their pocket, and John Bolton was the one advising Trump on Iran. So they had a monopoly on Trump's vision for regime change in Iran, which meant that despite that Pence was sympathetic to some extent, we had very little latitude to be able to influence a Washington policy.
Whoa. Deeply entrenched in this stuff you were.
Yes.
How and what? From a guy who, born and raised in New York, philosopher, you're willing to go fight and be executed for this regime change in Iran. Why did you feel so strongly about this?
Why did Tom Paine go to Paris, after playing a tremendously successful role in catalyzing the American Revolution? I mean, if you look, I'm trained in philosophy. He was a corset maker. I mean, the guy made underwear, women's underwear for a living. But he wrote great books, and he was certainly a first-rate thinker. If you read, The Age of Reason, The Rights of Man, books that Tom Paine wrote in prison in Paris after he went and enlisted in the French Revolution and almost got himself guillotined, right? Mm-hmm. He wrote those books thinking that he was facing a certain death sentence. I mean, rather the Age of Reason he did, which tears the Bible to pieces. In his book, The Age of Reason, Tom Paine argues that the United States Constitution is fundamentally incompatible with Christianity, or rather that, a population that believes in the Bible cannot constitute a good citizenry for the United States. And he writes this book in prison in Paris. This is why he's not on Mount Rushmore, which he should be. He's like the black sheep among the founding fathers. They all thought that he said publicly what many of them thought privately a little too often. Anyway, my point is this, that, look, you can be a thinker who has all kinds of idealistic aspirations for how you want to see the world change. And you can elaborate very transcendent and inspiring principles to try to recalibrate the direction of society. But unless you're willing to get your hands dirty and stake your life on it, who knows whether your vision will ever materialize, or who, in the wake of your inevitable death someday, might misappropriate your vision, right, to create some kind of a tyrannical system. I mean, this is what happened with Marx. Marx would never have endorsed the Soviet Union, right? So maybe Marx should have been more of an activist during his own lifetime.
Right. What was it inherent in you that made you explore all these deep thoughts? And what is this might be a stupid question, but what is like your process when you are writing about this stuff?
Okay, there's a lot of questions there. It's a very compound question.
Yeah.
So first of all, I think it's a number of things that, made me the thinker that I am. I had certain intellectual interests from the get-go, even in my teenage years, in looking on the one hand at the religious history of mankind, and on the other hand at cutting-edge developments in the sciences, right? Paradigm-defying breakthroughs in the sciences, and seeing, how science and religion could be reconciled. That was a very early intellectual interest of mine. At, let's say, 15, 16 years old, I was on the one hand reading the physicist David Bohm, the biologist Rupert Sheldrake, Michael Talbot and his theory of the holographic universe. And on the other hand, I was reading, the Bhagavad Gita, the Tao Te Ching, and, various other, the Sufi texts and spiritual treasures of human history. So this question of the relationship between science and religion was one that I had on a theoretical level from a very early age. But then also I had experiences that shaped my thinking.
What kind of experiences?
I write about the paranormal in a very abstract way, and with a view to developing novel philosophical concepts that can help us to understand why, what we take to be reality works the way that it does. But I've also had personal experiences of what you might call, the paranormal. And they started, fairly early on, right? So at the same time that I was reading, edge science like Bohm and Sheldrake on the one hand, and reading Indian and Persian mystical texts and Taoist scriptures, I also had a near-death experience when I was, I think, actually 14. I was at a sleepaway summer camp in Amherst, at Amherst College. It was like a prep school / summer camp type of thing. And one night, I think it was probably around 2:00 in the morning, asleep in my bed, and I noticed that my heart is beating. I'm asleep, but I become aware of the fact that I'm sleeping. And there's no sensory stimuli whatsoever. It's just blackness. And I become aware of my heartbeat. And it gets slower and slower until it stops. And when my heart stopped, I felt myself shoot out of my body. Not through the crown of my head. People talk about crown chakra or whatever, but it was actually through my feet that I left my body. And I was pulled into this voidness, which I don't know, it's really almost indescribable. It's ineffable, but it was like a bluish black seething dynamic energy that was at the same time a void. And it felt like it would annihilate my whole persona, that I would be swallowed by this. And when I went into this vortex, I saw my own death in the future. Now, let me be very careful to make this point here, that one strong line of argument throughout all of my philosophical work is against any kind of determinism. okay? And I make a very strong case that we have free will, or at least some degree of significant agency and intentionality. We can come back to my argument against God. This is one of the reasons why I reject the idea of an all-knowing and all-powerful God, because I think that that very idea is inimical to an affirmation of our free will. So, I don't think anything is fated. There's no future that's fated, and I can tell you some interesting stories that remote.
Fated? What does that mean?
There's no such thing as fate. The future.
Fate. Okay.
Yeah, there's no such thing as fate. We're not fated to live anything in the future. And I can tell you interesting stories from some of the remote viewers I've known. Like, for example, I'll tell you a story about the time when Lynn Buchanan was hired to see the next 9/11 after 9/11 happened, and how he actually changed that timeline. But we'll come back to that.
You said you saw your own death.
Yeah, so I saw my own death in the future. And I don't want to say too much about this because I don't want to give anyone any ideas, but basically it was in the context, I have to say, disturbingly enough, of a second American Civil War, and I was not old. And I saw my death, and after that, I came back to the room. And I tell you, the closet in front of me was open. The two closet doors were open. And I'm not a fearful person, as you might gather from some of the things I've told you already. I don't scare easily, but looking into the darkness of that closet at 2:30 in the morning or whatever it was after I came out of this experience, I felt like the blackness of that closet was going to swallow me. And I could not stand for another minute being in that room. So I got up and I went down the hall to my friend's room. And this guy, he had come to this summer camp with me, but he had been my best friend for many years. And he was a few doors down. And I wake him up and I sit down next to him, and he slowly wakes up. And as soon as he looks at me, he looks into my eyes, and he gets the most terrified expression on his face that I've ever seen on another person. And he goes back under his covers and he won't come out. And notice, I'm already flipped out myself. I'm coming there looking for some consolation. And this is how my best friend reacts. So I find myself repeatedly saying to the guy, it's just me. It's just me. What are you doing? Why are you reacting like this? It's just me. And he comes out from under the covers and slowly, very hesitantly peers at me. And then and I say to him, well, what the hell was that? Why'd you react like that? And he said, it was your eyes. They weren't your eyes. And it was like you were looking right through my soul. So then we're sitting there, and now it's almost 3:00 in the morning, right? And somebody knocks on the window. Amherst College, middle of nowhere, Massachusetts, small town, 3:00 in the morning, knock on the window. And at first, we're really freaked out, and we don't want to even pull the curtain aside to see who the hell this might be. But they keep knocking, and we do. And there's this guy standing out there in the dark with a giant instrument case, like, I don't know, violin case or some kind of, musical. And he says, do you know the way to the opera house? And I go to him, this is a college. What opera house? What are you talking about? This is a college. And he goes like this to me. And we closed the curtains, and that was that. So that happened when I was 14. And
how did you die? Did you think you had your heart actually stopped?
All I can tell you is...
Or was this some sort of crazy dream?
No, it was not a dream. It was definitely not a dream. All I can tell you is, as we say in philosophy, phenomenologically speaking, right? Being very attentive to what I actually experienced. At the time, it felt like my heart stopped.
Was there any reason that would have happened? Did you take anything?
No. I didn't take any drugs or anything like that. No. Now, the other possibility is this, that, look, there are phenomena where there's a kind of dilation of consciousness where your sense of the passage of time changes dramatically. And one possibility...
Dilation of consciousness.
Yeah. So, like, you can, when you're in very intense states of consciousness, time flows differently for you.
Yes.
You don't notice how many hours have gone by.
Right.
You're completely immersed in something, right? And it's possible that what actually was happening is that my sense of time warped to where it slowed down to where my consciousness sank into the space between two heartbeats. That feeling as if my heartbeat were getting slower and slower was actually my experience of the passage of time changing. But in any case, it basically was this NDE where I left my body and I saw this precognitive vision of my death. And I'm sure that acted as a significant catalyst, like a lightning bolt to further intensify my interest in, these edge science subjects and religious scriptures and so forth that I was reading at the time already.
Did you write about this after it happened?
No. First of all, it was unforgettable. So I didn't need to write it down. I write a lot of things down, but this was so unforgettable I couldn't write it down. I didn't need to write it down. But here's the interesting thing is that I couldn't even talk to anybody about this. I tried to tell a couple people about this. And again, I said, I am not a person who scares easily. But the emotional impact of this event was such that whenever I tried to tell anybody about it, I just felt like I was going to start weeping. So I couldn't talk about it for a long time.
And you said it was in the context of an American Civil War, and you were not old.
Yes, there was a second American Civil War. There was massive, or some kind of just massive urban upheaval, uprising in this country. And I was dead in that context, let's just say, not to get into the details. And the situation in our country doesn't look too good right now.
How much have you thought about that?
I've thought about it quite a bit. But, I don't want to be morbidly preoccupied with it. One has to focus on positive projects and concrete goals, right? But let me tell you, I brought up in the course of that story this example of how it is that we have free will and that we can shift timelines and why nothing is inevitable. I was sitting in Lynn Buchanan's living room a few years back. He was the chief trainer for the entire CIA remote viewing program. He's the guy who trained all the other guys.
Yeah, I was gonna say Joe McMoneagle also saw his own death, didn't he?
Yes, that's right. So Lynn was involved with Joe McMoneagle in Project Stargate, and he was there through the changing of hands of the program from the CIA to the DoD. And he was the guy responsible for training the other ACE remote viewers. Mm. And he told me that, I believe it was sometime after he had already retired, and he was doing private corporate consulting. So companies, they still come to him. Companies come to him and ask him to do remote viewing for them. And so this is what he was doing.
All right, guys, I'm going to end it here. Continue it tomorrow.
Early 2000s.
And listen to his full story tomorrow,
2004, somewhere in there.
Because we passed too much time now.
And they said to him, we want you to remote view the next 9/11. We want to know what the next terrorist attack against the United States on that scale is going to be.
So
when is this, by the way?
Early 2000s.
Early 2000s.
Yeah. I forget the exact year.
So right after 9/11.
Yeah, exactly. They came to him and they said, look, we understand you're retired, but, do us a favor and remote view the next 9/11 for us. And he did. He put a team together and they remote viewed this event. And they said, Islamic terrorists were going to approach the United States in boats that were full of biological agents, that it was going to be a horrendous biowarfare attack on the southeastern seaboard of the United States. So like in an area between, I think, like the Carolinas and like Georgia, like that area, right? And he said they were going to come in on these boats, and once they got to the coast, they were going to release this biological contagion, and it would be far worse than 9/11. Tens and tens of thousands of people would die. And he was able to give them the date down to the day of when this was going to happen. So here's what happens. On that day, the Coast Guard goes out, and they intercepted these ships.
Wow.
These ships were coming to the United States.
Wow.
And they did have these biological agents on them, and they were intercepted, and these people were rounded up.
Is this recorded?
I could understand why, if this happened, it would be classified. But this is what he told me, that he got confirmation that he had been correct, and that based on the intelligence he provided, the terrorists were intercepted.
And do you know when was this day?
I don't think he told me the date.
Do you know a year?
I don't remember. He did tell me the year, but it was in the early 2000s. And this is what he told. And so here's my point, is that he saw this event take place vividly. Mm. It's a clear precognition of the future. So clear he was able to volunteer the date, but he changed the timeline. So this is, empirical evidence for the ontological fact that we have free will or some degree of intentionality and agency. That nothing is fated.
How so?
How so? In the sense that, look, if, for example, you're me and you see your own death, it doesn't necessarily have to happen that way. You can change the course of events that leads to that.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Because they were able to intercept them.
Yeah.
The future is not written.
And this has happened many times. Look, the remote viewer, cognitive
All right, guys, I'm gonna
remote viewing routinely in order to engage in hostage rescue attempts. When, like, for example, American hostages were taken prisoner in Lebanon in the 1980s and so forth. They would routinely try to see the future movement of hostages and things like that, so they could send people to intercept them and retrieve them at certain places.
Right. Yeah, this is something I read about in Annie Jacob. I first read about it in Annie's book, Phenomena.
Yeah.
Where she talks to Edgar Mitchell. Going back from he talks about he did this like secret experiment coming back from the moon, seeing if he could do some sort of telekinesis or remote viewing on his way back. And it's interesting too, all of this science, this sort of squishy science, she calls it, science that can't be replicated in a laboratory, right? It's not
it can be, bro. It can be.
It's hard to measure.
No, it can be.
It all came from the Nazis.
Yes. Okay. So two very interesting subjects.
It's not coming from Nazis.
Let's start with the hard to measure, right? And here we're getting into the meat of my work, my actual philosophical ideas. I would push back on the fact that it's hard to measure. There are all kinds of sciences. And one of the most misguided things that scientists try to do, irrespective of which discipline they're in, is to hold every science to the standard of rigor that obtains in physics, right?
The scientific method.
No, well, look, there's a scientific method in psychology, too.
Okay.
It doesn't mean that the dynamics of somebody's personal psychology or the evolution of various societies and, what it is that produces social crises or what it is that, what conditions are likely to lead to the collapse of government are phenomena that are as predictable as, atomic physics, right?
Right.
So depending on what domain you're studying, different standards of rigor are appropriate. Not everything is equally amenable to, mathematical modeling and prediction, right? And insofar as psi is a human ability, just like sports ability, or like the virtuoso talent of musicians, human beings are not mechanical contraptions. You're not going to be able to predict their behavior with the same standard that, you can predict, rocket trajectories in Newtonian physics. It's absurd to expect that. So different sciences have methodologies that are appropriate to the domain that they're researching.
Absolutely.
Right? And psi is a phenomenon to some extent of biology, but to a great extent of psychology, right? And you should never expect the kind of repeatability that you have in physics and chemistry in the domain of parapsychology research. But I think a bigger problem is that, the sciences always operate within the context of one or another paradigm, right? So you have hypotheses that are testable, and in any given scientific theory, there are a number of hypotheses that come together to form that theory. But various scientific theories are also only possible in the context of a paradigm, which is an overarching framework of assumptions, of basic assumptions, that orient your perspective on things in general. It's like a theoretical framework, pre-theoretical framework of abstract thought that defines what questions are even being asked to begin with and what's being marginalized as outside the scope of inquiry. It's like a narrowed perspective on one or another domain. And this defines what theories can even be elaborated in the first place. Thomas Kuhn, in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, in the 1960s, he made this argument that scientific paradigms are radically political, that the revolutions that take place in the history of science, the Copernican revolution in physics, the Darwinian revolution, are as political revolutions. And that the reason why groups of scientists in one or another period invest in a particular paradigm, and the way in which these paradigms get entrenched and limit the kinds of questions that are even asked and the kinds of subjects that are researched, it's thoroughly political. It's motivated by the same psychological dynamics as people's commitment to one or another political ideology.
Greed, that's a huge part of it.
That's huge, because funding, you don't get funding in various, areas of scientific research unless you're conforming to the established criteria for what's legitimate to research or not, right? And unless you're working with an already established set of theories, right? So you have, for example, in physics today, this fundamental contradiction between Einsteinian relativity and quantum theory. Mm-hmm. And, in the UFO subject, it's a very hotly debated issue of whether there's a third theory that's going to encompass both relativity and quantum theory and give us a working knowledge of gravity that would allow, zero-point energy propulsion, that would allow electrogravitic propulsion.
Right.
But one of the things that I argue in my philosophical works is that it's a mistake to think that scientific theories are meant to accurately represent some objectively existing reality, that scientific theories are like mirrors, where all you need to do is polish the mirror well enough, and you're going to get a reflection of structures that exist in nature. So that we assume that relativity is an imperfect mirror, and quantum theory is an imperfect mirror. And there's some other theoretical mirror that's going to reconcile these two, that's going to give us a more adequate reflection of the nature of reality, right? And it's going to afford us the breakthrough to electrogravitic propulsion. I think that's mistaken. Theories, I argue, coming from out of Kuhn, Wittgenstein, Heidegger, other people in the history of philosophy and science, theories are toolkits. They're toolboxes. They have an ultimately practical significance. A scientific theory is only as good as what we can do with it, which, by the way, is why string theory was such a con job in the last 20 years, right? String theory is this elaborate mathematical formalism, which has absolutely no practical significance, and it has really no testability either. And I think probably the thing was developed as a ruse to move mainstream researchers away from any kind of research trajectory that would lead to cracking quantum gravity.
Yeah. Who do you think was behind that ruse? Aliens?
No.
Have you seen that new show, Three Body Problem?
Yeah, I have.
Fascinating. How they're on their way here and they're trying to subvert our science on Earth.
It was good aesthetically. Some of the storytelling was good. I had a couple of really big problems with it. Yeah. One was that, what is this, less than light speed travel? These people don't have 0-point energy, these aliens.
Light speed.
Yeah, what the hell is that? I mean, we have in Lockheed right now, there are craft that can go to Mars in a few hours, right now in Lockheed. And this show is talking about the aliens are traveling at certain percentages of the speed of light. That was one problem I had with it, is the engineering and physics. The other problem I had is the whole show took place within the context of a very reductionist materialist paradigm that did not acknowledge psi, didn't acknowledge ESP and psychokinesis, and the fact that these aliens would probably have these abilities, to a much greater degree than terrestrial humanity.
Right.
So these were, some plot points that I had a problem with, but it was entertaining for sure.
What did you think about those sophons, those protons that were quantumly entangled to help us? You're saying that they wouldn't have needed those. They would have been able to use some sort of telekinesis or psycho.
Well, the sophons, if I'm not mistaken, if I remember correctly, in that show were portrayed as a form of artificial intelligence, that they were like nano machines that were working based on a kind of artificial intelligence.
Right.
And what I think is that even the artificial intelligence systems that we're developing now at OpenAI and Google and so forth are demonstrating psi ability. and this is one of the things that's being covered up by the engineers. They're terrified of it. They don't understand it. And they're trying to pass it off as bugs and glitches in the system. But really, they're encountering psi in the context of laboratory R&D on AI, which, by the way, is something that I predicted in my book, Prometheism, which was written in 2020. I predicted exactly this, that high-level, big-budget AI research would eventually provide the final validation of parapsychological phenomena. And that what I call the spectral revolution, like the Copernican revolution, Darwinian revolution, the spectral revolution that makes parapsychology mainstream is going to come about not in a parapsychology laboratory, but in a really well-funded AI R&D program. And that's in fact what's happening.
So how do you know what they have at JPL? How do you know they have...
Not JPL, Lockheed.
Lockheed. How do you know that Lockheed has this technology that we can get to Mars in a couple hours?
So I know a guy who has been to one of these facilities. I don't think I should mention who he is, but he is, let's say...
Not Jack Sarfati.
I'm sorry, Jack. No disrespect.
Love you, Jack.
Yeah. There's a reason that guy hasn't been dealt in. Okay. The reverse. I mean, not the least of which is that he goes out and publicly advertises everything that anyone ever tells him. So, I don't think that Lockheed or Northrop or anyone will be willing to deal him into any of these reverse engineering programs. But I know this guy who was involved in the military intelligence at a high level. And actually, I know two different people who've been to this facility. And they say that, Lockheed has, I think, some assets in Nevada, but they have a lot of corporate facilities in California, in the state of California. And supposedly there is this shack on the side of a highway in California that looks like some nondescript warehouse, small warehouse. And you go into this warehouse and the whole floor of the warehouse is an elevator. And it drops Lord knows how many hundreds of feet. And you're inside of basically a facility carved out of rock, deep underground.
Yeah.
And what this guy said is that they are not only reverse engineering craft from retrieved debris in this facility, but they're actually training pilots to fly them. And he told me that the main problem that they have in that training program is that the pilots experience extreme disorientation because of the warping of space-time by these craft. In other words, they discovered early on, and this is, I think, one of the main reasons, and we can get into this in much more depth if you want. This is one of the main reasons this technology is being hidden, because they discovered very early on that these are not simply devices with propulsion systems capable of navigating space very quickly. Like they can take you from New York to Australia and, right? They're flying time machines. They warp time as they traverse space.
Right.
And our pilots don't know how to handle that. They have a very hard time. They get disoriented, temporally disoriented. They get their sense of the passage of time gets really messed with.
How do you know this wasn't just some sort of intelligence agent or intelligence operative trying to disseminate some wacky information like the other guy?
Well, if I were to tell you who it was, I think most people wouldn't think that. But all I can tell you...
That's the problem with this whole topic. That is the fundamental problem with this whole UFO topic. Is because so many people have such crazy, outlandish claims, and every single one of them, almost every single time, they're saying that this person, they can't divulge where they got the information, who the person is. And that's why this topic has been so frustrating for me.
Yeah. I'll tell you at dinner who he is.
Okay.
So he was, but I'll tell you this, he was an extremely salt-of-the-earth person. And he was involved in the military intelligence community for decades. And anyway, I'll just leave it at that. But one of the funny things is he showed me this model that they had been using back in it looked like maybe it was something from the 60s, to teach these pilots how much time dilation there is per the amount of space that they've traversed in these vehicles. It was like some kind of a gyroscopic device. And it showed that if you traverse, this much distance in space, there's this much dilation in time. And the reason he had this thing is because it was antiquated. It was like from the 60s, and they weren't using it anymore. They had ripped it out, and it was like an heirloom, Yeah. And they basically gave it to him as a keepsake. So, which I found interesting. And I tried to take a picture of it, but he picked it up and took it away from me. So anyway, he told me he went down into this facility and that they're reverse engineering stuff, and that they're trying to train pilots in how to fly these reverse engineered zero-point energy craft. But okay, what's the really important thing about that is that on a theoretical level, I've written extensively in Closer Encounters about how UFOs are actually time machines. And if you really stop and think through that carefully, you realize why, under the current socio-political conditions, this technology can't be released. With the kind of society we have, domestically, globally, with the state that humanity is in at the present time, the release of that kind of technology into the public sphere would be utterly catastrophic, right? I mean, you can't give Tom, Dick, and Harry a time machine to put in their garage. You see, that's the thing. It's not like these are Jetsons cars that just, fly you across country really fast. They allow you to traverse different epochs in human history. And I think one of the reasons that our history is so messed up, when you look at these really regressive, tyrannical religious belief systems and the kinds of political structures that formed around them and that were fortified by them, I think a lot of what's going on there is that our timeline has been manipulated. It's been manipulated at all junctures, from the present far into the future, right? So the technological singularity is this moment when you have a convergent advancement of all kinds of technologies, from genetic engineering to nanotech to artificial intelligence, cybernetics, and so forth. And they start to advance exponentially, so that it's no longer a curve slowly sloping up, right? It
All right,
becomes
guys.
a spike on a graph.
We'll continue
The curve
tomorrow.
becomes
The
a spike.
same
There's such an
thing,
acceleration
just to make
in the
sure
development.
that I'll give you this answer too, that how all this remote viewing actually works. If you want to try yourself, you can do it. It's not a fucking rocket science. It's very easy. The whole thing you can learn. I'll show you tomorrow. I'll see you tomorrow. Then tomorrow morning, I think it's pretty long one, this one. Thanks. Goodbye.